the lens and the field. A living codex of perception, recognition, and reality formation. This is not a book of belief. This is not a system to adopt. This is a mirror, not of the world, but of the way the world is being seen. Before meaning, there is perception. Before perception, there is contact. Before contact, there is awareness. And between all of these, there is a lens, unseen, assumed, mistaken for reality itself. Everything you call the world is filtered through it. What appears fixed? What appears possible? What appears real? This text does not explain reality. It reveals the mechanism through which reality is experienced. There is a moment where the lens loosens. Recognition, not learned, not constructed, seen. From that point, nothing is added. Only more becomes visible. Enter not to believe, but to look, not at the world, but at the way the world is appearing. Chapter 1, The Lens Before the World. Before meaning, there is seeing. Before explanation, there is contact. Before the mind says this, before language says that, before memory reaches forward and wraps the living moment in an already known structure, something far more primary has already occurred. Reality has already been met. A signal has already crossed the threshold. A contact has already been made. And yet even this contact is not clean in the way the ordinary mind imagines it to be, because by the time the human system says, I am seeing reality, reality has already been filtered through a lens that was present before the conscious self ever learned to question its own seeing. This is the first veil, not fantasy, not fiction, not hallucination, not some decorative spiritual metaphor meant to beautify confusion. The first veil is far more intimate than that. It is the simple fact that the world is never encountered in a raw and untouched state by the conditioned human system. The world is encountered through a mode of filtering so total, so immediate, and so constant that it becomes invisible to the one looking through it. It does not appear as a lens. It appears as reality itself. And because it appears as reality itself, it is rarely examined. What is closest to awareness is often the least likely to be seen, because it is assumed before it is observed. This is the hidden architecture of ordinary experience. The human being does not merely look at the world. The human being looks through a way of looking. The human does not simply receive existence. The human receives existence through a conditioned aperture of selection, contrast, valuation, and symbolic anticipation. The eye may gather light. The nervous system may register signal. The mind may produce meaning. But before meaning arises, before symbolic structure crystallizes, there is already a shaping influence determining what will be foreground and what will be background, what will be treated as signal and what will be reduced to noise, what will be perceived as threat and what will be perceived as neutral, what will be felt as near and what will be felt as remote, what will be allowed entry into awareness and what will never be consciously noticed at all. This is why the lens is not secondary. It is not a cosmetic layer placed on top of neutral reality. It is not merely opinion. It is not just perspective in the shallow sense people usually mean when they say, everyone has their own perspective. Perspective is already downstream. Perspective is already a formed expression. The lens sits earlier. The lens participates in the birth of what can later become perspective. It determines not merely how one interprets what is seen, but in large measure what becomes available to be seen in the first place. This is why two human beings can stand in the same room, hear the same words, witness the same event, and walk away carrying entirely different worlds within them. It is not only that they came to different conclusions. It is not only that they framed the same event differently. It is that the event itself did not arrive into the same internal field in the same way. Different filters were active. Different saliencies were prioritized. Different symbolic hooks were already primed. Different emotional structures were waiting to organize the incoming material. Different assumptions about danger, possibility, identity, belonging, value, and meaning were already shaping the passage of reality before the conscious self ever announced, this is what happened. So the ordinary claim that human beings see reality is already too simplistic to hold. Human beings do not merely see. Human beings see through. They see through conditioning. They see through memory. They see through inherited symbolic frameworks. They see through emotional structures that were established before language matured. They see through collective agreements so old and so normalized that they no longer appear as agreements at all. And because they see through these things without recognizing that they are seeing through them, the filter becomes fused with the world. The aperture becomes confused with existence. The conditioned mode of contact becomes mistaken for the nature of reality itself, and this confusion is the birthplace of illusion. Illusion here does not mean the unreal in the childish sense. It does not mean that nothing exists. It does not mean that life is a dream in the weak sense of dismissing the gravity of experience. Illusion means that what is being taken as total reality is only a filtered presentation of it. Illusion means that the map has become so intimate with the territory that the distinction between them has collapsed in ordinary awareness. Illusion means that filtering has become invisible. It means selection has hidden itself. It means what is partial is being experienced as whole. It means a conditioned aperture is passing itself off as direct reality. This is why the first veil is so fundamental. It does not operate at the level of explicit belief alone. Beliefs are later. Beliefs are articulated products. The first veil is active before articulated belief. It lives in the unquestioned structure of experience itself. It lives in the unnoticed compression of possibility. It lives in the silent assumptions built into what one automatically treats as real, fixed, relevant, or impossible. It lives in the immediate and pre-verbal sense of what the world is and how the world works. Long before a person says, "This is just how it is," the lens has already been enforcing that sentence through the architecture of perception. When the lens is unexamined, what is noticed becomes destiny. What is ignored becomes invisible law. What is possible becomes restricted not by reality itself, but by the field of what the conditioned system can presently admit into awareness. What is impossible becomes not an objective impossibility, but a perceptual exclusion masquerading as truth. This is one of the deepest mechanics of contraction in the human experience. People do not only suffer from what happens. They suffer from what their lens makes available as happening. They do not only live inside events. They live inside filtered contact with events. They live inside structured access to reality. And because this access is rarely recognized as structured, the structure is mistaken for existence. The unseen lens writes the first draft of the world. This is why the first movement in genuine seeing is not acquiring more concepts. It is not decorating the mind with better language. It is not becoming more verbally sophisticated about reality while leaving the original filter untouched. The first movement is more radical and more simple. It is the recognition that the one who says "I am seeing clearly" may in fact be looking through inherited machinery they have never once brought into conscious view. It is the recognition that what feels most obvious may be the most conditioned. It is the recognition that immediacy is not the same as purity, and familiarity is not the same as truth. The lens was shaped before it was questioned. This matters profoundly. It means that much of what later feels self-evident was installed before conscious discernment matured. Family systems shape it. Cultural agreements shape it. Language shapes it. Emotional injury shapes it. Social reward structures shape it. Fear shapes it. Repetition shapes it. Collective normalization shapes it. The system slowly learns not only how to think, but what counts as real enough to think about. It learns where attention should go. It learns which distinctions matter. It learns what should be dismissed. It learns what must be defended. It learns how to pre-sort existence before reflective awareness ever arrives on the scene and begins asking philosophical questions about truth. So when the human later begins the journey of awakening, inquiry, meditation, self-observation, or direct recognition, what is actually being encountered is not merely the world. It is the lens through which the world has long been encountered. This is why such work can feel destabilizing. The system is not merely learning something new. It is coming into contact with the possibility that its most basic mode of seeing has never been neutral. It begins to realize that the world it has been inhabiting was not simply the world, but the world as organized by a particular filter. And once this recognition begins, a profound shift becomes possible, because the system starts to differentiate between reality and the manner in which reality has been rendered. This is the beginning of freedom, though not yet its completion. Freedom does not begin when one masters the world. Freedom begins when one can finally perceive that one has not been meeting the world directly. Freedom begins when the filter is no longer total. Freedom begins when the lens becomes visible enough to be recognized as lens. Until then, every attempt to change one's life while leaving the lens intact will remain partial. The person will rearrange content while preserving the very mechanism that generated the old world. They will change conclusions while preserving the filter that produced them. They will seek different outcomes while remaining inside the same architecture of perception. And because of this, they will unknowingly recreate the same patterns under new names. The veil is not removed by force. It is removed by seeing that it was there. The first veil falls not when reality changes, but when filtering becomes visible. This is the sacred violence of recognition. Not violence against life, but violence against unconscious certainty. Violence against the assumption that what appears first is therefore what is. Violence against the reflex that mistakes conditioned contact for truth. The first veil is pierced the moment the system no longer confuses its own perceptual structuring with existence itself. This does not instantly perfect the human being. It does not grant omniscience. It does not eliminate all filtering at once. But it changes everything, because once the lens is seen as lens, it cannot fully return to being mistaken for the world. And this is why the chapter must begin here. Not with meaning. Not with philosophy. Not with doctrine. Not with morality. Not with social systems. Not with symbols. Not even with recognition itself. It begins here because before all of that, there is the question no fragmented world once asked too deeply. What is shaping the seeing before the world becomes the world? Everything that follows depends on this. Because if the lens remains invisible, then distinction will be unconsciously formed, symbols will be unconsciously generated, structures will be unconsciously obeyed, and reality will continue to be mistaken for the rendering of reality. But if the lens becomes visible, then the entire chain begins to loosen. What was taken as fixed becomes questionable. What was taken as impossible becomes revisitable. What was taken as reality becomes recognized as filtered contact with reality. And this is the threshold where the first true opening occurs. Before the world becomes the world, it is filtered. Before interpretation, there is contact. Before meaning, there is seeing. And before seeing becomes clear, the lens must be revealed. Chapter 2, Distinction, the Birth of Form. From the lens, distinction emerges. Not because reality arrives already labeled. Not because existence hands itself to the observer in neat and separated pieces. Not because the world presents itself in the rigid and finalized categories through which the human mind later knows it. Reality is not given as a completed inventory of isolated objects with names already attached. It is not delivered as a finished symbolic system. It is not born as language. It is not born as concept. It is not born as this and that in the way the conditioned mind later assumes. It is encountered as living signal, living relation, living movement, living continuity. And then, through the operation of perception, something extraordinary and world-shaping occurs. Reality is parsed. This parsing is one of the deepest creative acts of the human system, though ordinarily it is never experienced as creative. It is experienced as obvious. It feels automatic because it is constant. It feels natural because it began before conscious examination. It feels objective because the distinctions it produces become so stable within ordinary experience that they appear to be inherent in existence itself. Yet distinction is not the world in its untouched wholeness. Distinction is the carving of experiential continuity into identifiable differences. It is the emergence of edge, contrast, separation, form, and category from a field that, prior to parsing, is not yet present in the neatly divided way the human being later thinks of as reality. This is the birth of form. Not form in the absolute sense of matter merely existing, but form in the experiential and perceptual sense. Form as the result of difference becoming legible. Form as the consequence of contrast entering awareness. Form as the appearance of something as this rather than that. Form as the internal rendering of a distinguishable world. Before distinction, there is no usable object in the way the mind later knows objects. There may be signal. There may be relation. There may be energy. There may be process. But the felt and known experience of discrete form emerges through parsing. The lens does not merely color the world. The lens participates in the drawing of its boundaries. Edges are drawn, differences are extracted, categories are formed. And because this happens so early in the chain of experience, the human being usually mistakes the result for the source. The categories seem primordial. The distinctions seem self-evident. The partitions seem to have been there from the beginning. Yet what feels self-evident is often only what has been repeated long enough to become invisible as process. The human mind does not simply discover a fully divided world. It participates in the division. It is not inventing reality from nothing, but neither is it passively receiving reality in a purely unmediated state. It is engaging in an active shaping of what becomes available as experience. This is where the symbolic order begins its silent construction. Something is distinguished. Then it is stabilized. Then it is named. Then the name begins to stand in for the thing. Then the name enters memory, language, agreement, and culture. Then the distinction hardens. Then the symbol begins to look natural. Then the symbol begins to look inevitable. Then the category begins to masquerade as reality itself. Then entire worlds are built downstream of a distinction that no one any longer remembers was once an act of parsing. This is where green becomes green, not because the reality being referred to lacks structure. Not because wavelengths do not differ. Not because there is no underlying distinction available in the field of signal. But because a perceptual separation was made and then rendered into symbolic form. A difference became salient. Salience became distinction. Distinction became symbol. Symbol became agreement. Agreement became the way things are. And once this entire chain has fully formed, the ordinary observer no longer perceives the symbol as symbol. They perceive the symbol as reality. But the name is not the thing. The category is not the field. The distinction is not the whole. The map is not the territory. And yet the human being, born into already stabilized symbolic systems, learns to treat inherited distinctions as if they were reality in its primary and final form. This is one of the deepest operations of conditioned experience. The child does not enter a world of pure contact and then freely build language from scratch. The child enters an already divided symbolic environment. The world has been named in advance. Objects have been sorted in advance. Social meanings have been organized in advance. Emotional valences have often been attached in advance. Entire ontologies have been pre-installed into language itself. So when the child learns the world, they are not simply learning what exists. They are learning how existence has already been divided by those who came before. They are inheriting distinctions. They are inheriting categories. They are inheriting symbolic cuts into reality that carry not only descriptive function, but often whole hidden assumptions about what matters, what is separate, what belongs together, what should be feared, what should be valued, what counts as possible, and what counts as real. All symbols are downstream of distinction. This must be seen in its full depth, because it is far more radical than it first appears. It means language does not touch reality directly. Language touches divisions of reality. Concepts do not arise from the whole as whole. Concepts arise from selected separations within the whole. Meaning does not begin at the level of pure existence. Meaning begins after the field has already been partitioned into usable experiential units. This is why all human understanding, in its ordinary form, is already structured by prior distinctions. The mind does not simply think about reality. It thinks within a pre-cut version of it. This is also why changing language alone never reaches the root. One can rename without re-seeing. One can alter vocabulary while preserving the same perceptual distinctions underneath. One can speak more elegantly and remain trapped in the same ontology. One can acquire better words while seeing through the same lens. The transformation does not begin with symbol. Symbol is already downstream. The real shift begins earlier, where perception itself changes the way continuity is carved, the way edges are found, the way distinctions arise, the way categories form. Once that changes, language follows. Meaning follows. The world reorders because the divisions from which the symbolic world is built have changed. All meaning is downstream of perception. This does not mean meaning is false. It does not mean symbol is useless. It does not mean categories should be discarded in some naive attempt to return to undifferentiated experience. Distinction is not a mistake. It is a necessary operation for functioning as a localized being within a world of relation, action, navigation, embodiment, and communication. Without distinction, there would be no usable world. There would be no object recognition, no language, no coordination, no social ordering, no practical action, no science, no art, no memory structure, no personal identity, no relational orientation. Distinction is not the problem. Unseen distinction is the problem. Unquestioned division is the problem. The forgetting that distinctions are created through parsing is the problem. The human being begins to suffer when the cuts made by perception are mistaken for final and absolute reality. This is how the divided world becomes believed. First, reality is parsed. Then what has been parsed is named. Then what has been named is repeated. Then what is repeated is stabilized. Then what is stabilized becomes unquestioned. Then what is unquestioned becomes believed. Not because belief is always consciously chosen, but because the distinction has been normalized to the point that it disappears as distinction and stands only as world. At that stage, the human being does not experience themselves as believing a divided rendering of reality. They experience themselves as simply living in reality itself. This is the architecture beneath the phrase "that's just how it is." By the time that phrase is spoken, the division is already complete. A cut has already been made. The symbol has already hardened. The category has already stabilized. The perceptual operation has already vanished into apparent objectivity. The person no longer sees that they are living inside a divided rendering of the world. They see only the rendering, and call it existence. So the world you live in is not reality as it is reality as it has been divided. This does not mean reality has no structure outside of human perception. It does not mean distinctions are purely arbitrary at every level. It does not mean the human mind invents the cosmos. That would be another distortion. Underlying relations exist. Stable constraints exist. Patterns exist that do not depend on naming. Signal exists before symbol. But the world as lived, the world as known, the world as experienced internally, the world that becomes navigable by the human system, is not simply raw existence. It is existence as parsed through distinctions. The ordinary human does not inhabit the whole directly. The ordinary human inhabits a divided rendering of the whole. And once divided, it is believed. Belief here must be understood in a deeper sense than explicit ideology. Belief is not merely the conscious holding of propositions. It is the tacit trust the system places in its own distinctions. It is the unconscious allegiance to the categories through which experience has become organized. It is the body's trust in the world it has learned to navigate. It is the mind's assumption that what has been divided must have always been naturally separate. It is the habitual confidence placed in inherited symbolic order. This is why belief is so powerful. It is not just intellectual. It is embodied. It is structural. It is built into perception, language, expectation, reaction, and attention. At this level, belief is not something one does after thinking. It is something the system does by inhabiting distinctions as if they were ultimate. This is where fragmentation becomes ontological. Not because reality itself has shattered, but because the observer has forgotten the process through which distinctions emerged. Separate categories become separate worlds. Labels become essences. Names become prisons. Symbols become self-sealing. Human beings begin to live inside the consequences of their own parsing without recognizing the creative and selective operations by which that parsing took place. Then they suffer from what they believe is just reality, when in fact much of what they are struggling with is reality already divided, already interpreted, already symbolically stabilized. This is why the study of distinction is not academic. It is not decorative philosophy. It is foundational. To understand distinction is to begin understanding how worlds are built. To understand distinction is to begin understanding how separation becomes real in lived experience. To understand distinction is to begin understanding why changing ideas often changes nothing while changing perception changes everything. Because what the person calls the world is inseparable from the distinctions through which the world became form. Yet there is another layer here that must be seen. Distinction is not only a narrowing. It is also the condition of articulation. It is how the infinite becomes graspable within the finite. It is how continuity becomes navigable. It is how the undivided field becomes experienceable as a world of forms. So distinction must not be hated. It must not be demonized. It must not be treated as a cosmic error. Distinction is necessary. The issue is not distinction itself. The issue is unconscious distinction mistaken for ultimate truth. The issue is forgetting that all categories are downstream of perception. The issue is living inside divisions without awareness of their origin. This is where deeper seeing begins. Not by abolishing all form. Not by pretending categories do not exist. Not by refusing language. But by perceiving distinctions as distinctions. By recognizing categories as operative cuts rather than absolute realities. By remembering that the symbolic world is rendered from prior separations. By feeling directly that names are downstream, meaning is downstream, and the world of ordinary cognition is a structured division of a more primary field of relation than the fragmented mind usually knows how to perceive. When this begins to be seen, something loosens. The world does not vanish. Objects do not disappear. Language does not cease. But the tyranny of the category softens. The symbol stops masquerading as essence. The label is returned to its rightful place as tool rather than ruler. The observer starts to feel the difference between what is fundamentally there and the way it has been parsed. And in that subtle but immense shift, freedom begins to appear. Because once distinction is seen as birth rather than absolute given, the world becomes permeable again. Edges are still there, but they are no longer final. Categories still function, but they no longer imprison the real. Names still operate, but they no longer pretend to be the source. The observer begins to notice that form itself is a rendering, a necessary rendering, a beautiful rendering, but still a rendering. And in that noticing, reality is no longer trapped inside the partitions that once defined it. From the lens, distinction emerges. From distinction, form is born. From form, symbol arises. From symbol, belief stabilizes. And from belief, the world of the ordinary observer is built. To see this is not to destroy the world. It is to see how the world became the world. Chapter 3, Symbol, the Agreement Layer. Distinction becomes symbol. This is one of the most consequential movements in the entire architecture of human reality. A difference is first perceived. A boundary is first registered. A contrast is first extracted from the living field of experience. But a distinction alone does not yet become a world. A distinction alone does not yet become civilization, identity, law, custom, hierarchy, morality, ideology, destiny, or confinement. For any of that to occur, the distinction must be captured. It must be held. It must be rendered transferable. It must be made repeatable. And this is where symbol enters. A symbol is not merely a word. It is not merely a sound, a mark, a label, a name, or a sign. A symbol is the stabilization of a distinction into a transmissible unit. It is the moment where what was once a perceptual event becomes a shareable structure. It is where living difference is compressed into recognizable form so that it may be repeated, remembered, inherited, enforced, and built upon. This is why symbol is so powerful. Symbol is not passive description. Symbol is the mechanism by which distinction becomes socially real. Once a distinction becomes symbol, it no longer belongs only to the original act of seeing. It enters circulation. It enters language. It enters memory. It enters relationship. It enters culture. It enters institutions. It enters education. It enters law. It enters ritual. It enters expectation. It enters the invisible architecture of what a people call the world. This is why symbol is not secondary in its effects. It is downstream in origin, but upstream in consequence. It is born from distinction, yet it becomes the carrier through which distinctions solidify into worlds. Symbol becomes language. Language becomes structure. Structure becomes this is how it is. This sequence must be seen in its full force, because it is not merely semantic. It is ontological in its consequences for lived experience. When a symbol enters language, it acquires reach. Language does not merely name what is already there. Language organizes attention. Language stabilizes categories. Language dictates what can be easily thought, what can be easily communicated, what can be easily remembered, what can be socially reinforced, what can be institutionally rewarded, what can be legally recognized, what can be morally framed, what can be culturally normalized, and what can disappear into silence because no symbol was made available for it. Language is not just a mirror. It is an organizer of the world as humans experience it. This is why the birth of symbol is also the birth of shared agreement. Not agreement in the shallow sense of everybody consciously sitting down and voting on reality. Not agreement as a simplistic notion of deliberate collective design. Agreement in the deeper sense of repeated symbolic participation. Agreement is the silent consent produced when a distinction is named often enough, inherited early enough, reinforced widely enough, and questioned rarely enough that it becomes experienced as obvious. Agreement has the social field aligning itself around stabilized symbolic cuts into reality until those cuts no longer appear to be cuts at all. Agreement is the unnoticed convergence between language, repetition, expectation, and lived behavior. The symbol does not have to be fundamentally true in order to become structurally powerful. It only has to become sufficiently repeated, sufficiently normalized, sufficiently woven into the shared symbolic fabric that people stop perceiving it as one possible rendering among others and begin perceiving it as reality itself. This is where the system locks. Not because truth has been reached, but because questioning has ended. Not because a final reality has been directly apprehended, but because symbolic repetition has solidified one rendering of reality into an unquestioned frame. This is the agreement layer. The agreement layer is where symbols stop feeling like tools and begin feeling like facts. It is where language ceases to be recognized as constructed mediation and begins to masquerade as direct revelation of the real. It is where categories become so habituated that they are no longer experienced as categories. It is where a people inhabit symbolic structures so thoroughly that they cannot easily perceive the distinction between what exists and how existence has been named, framed, and rendered. The agreement layer is not merely a collection of words. It is the invisible field of stabilized symbolic assumptions through which a civilization experiences what is normal, possible, inevitable, moral, irrational, sacred, profane, real, unreal, self, other, progress, failure, identity, history, future, and destiny. This is why language becomes structure. Language does not remain floating in abstraction. It descends into systems. It crystallizes into expectations. It becomes educational frameworks, institutional categories, political realities, economic orders, scientific paradigms, therapeutic models, theological doctrines, social roles, familial scripts, legal definitions, and cultural defaults. Once symbol is sufficiently stabilized, it no longer needs to be argued at every step. It becomes embedded into the infrastructure of ordinary life. At that point, people do not merely believe the symbol. They live inside its consequences. They are born into its structures. They navigate through its assumptions. They inherit its permissions and prohibitions. They embody its categories before they ever consciously assess them. This is why repetition is more powerful than argument. What is repeated becomes familiar. What is familiar becomes naturalized. What is naturalized becomes invisible as construction. And what becomes invisible as construction becomes nearly indistinguishable from reality. This is the true force of stabilization. A symbol does not need to win by logic alone. It wins by becoming ambient. It wins by becoming the air. It wins by becoming the unspoken default through which all alternatives are filtered. Once that occurs, even those who resist a structure often resist from inside the symbolic terms of the structure itself. They may say no explicitly while continuing to inhabit the distinctions, categories, and assumptions through which the structure reproduces itself. Here the phrase is born. That's just how it is. This phrase is not truth. It is not wisdom. It is not direct contact with the foundational mechanics of reality. It is the endpoint of stabilized symbol becoming unquestioned structure. It is the sentence spoken by a system that has forgotten how its world was built. It is the sound made when repeated rendering hardens into apparent permanence. It is the linguistic seal placed over the invisible history of distinction, symbolization, repetition, normalization, and agreement. It is the final concealment of construction beneath the appearance of inevitability. This phrase matters because it reveals the mechanism in compressed form. That's just how it is does not merely describe reality. It freezes a rendering of reality into permanence. It removes the symbolic structure from view. It erases the prior distinctions that were made. It hides the interpretive and social processes that stabilized the symbol. It collapses possibility. It narrows perception. It reduces alternatives before they can fully appear. It tells awareness that no further seeing is necessary. It says, in effect, the work is done, the structure is final, the rendering is the real, the category is essence, the symbol is world. This is how living systems become trapped inside their own symbolic output. At first, humans create symbols to navigate reality. Later, symbols create the navigable world humans can imagine. What began as a tool for organizing experience becomes the invisible architecture through which experience itself is permitted. The instrument becomes the environment. The representation becomes the cage. The symbolic order becomes self-reinforcing because each new generation is born into the already stabilized field and mistakes its structures for the nature of existence. This is why unconscious agreement is so powerful. No conscious conspiracy is required. No singular villain is required. No metaphysical boogeyman is required. The mechanism is simpler and more pervasive. Distinction became symbol. Symbol became a language. Language became structure. Structure became the world as commonly lived. And the world, once rendered in this way, trained its participants to reproduce the rendering. This is the locking function of symbol. A symbol, once stabilized, begins to constrain what can be recognized. Not because recognition is impossible, but because the symbolic framework pre-sorts reality before recognition fully arrives. A person can look directly at a living moment and yet not perceive it freshly because the symbol has already done its work. The category has already claimed the field. The name has already outrun the seeing. The interpretation has arrived before the contact is consciously examined. Thus the human being does not simply experience reality and then describe it. More often, the human being experiences reality through the symbolic structures they have inherited, and then mistakes that filtered encounter for direct contact. This is why symbol can both enable and imprison. Without symbol, no shared civilization could emerge. No transmission of knowledge could persist. No continuity of culture could stabilize. No science could accumulate. No art could reverberate across generations. No relationship could coherently build memory. Symbol is not the enemy. It is necessary. It is sacred in its proper place. It allows the human to externalize distinction, to carry memory beyond the single moment, to coordinate with other minds, to build worlds of astonishing complexity. But when symbol is forgotten as symbol, when language is mistaken for reality, when categories are treated as eternal givens rather than stabilized renderings, then the generative function of symbol becomes a freezing function. What once served life begins to confine life. What once clarified now constricts. What once organized now imprisons. This is where many systems remain trapped for lifetimes. A person may live entirely inside symbols they never once consciously chose. They may defend categories they never generated. They may suffer under structures that were built from distinctions they do not even know were made. They may fight perceived enemies that are largely products of symbolic partition. They may uphold identities, histories, traumas, loyalties, and limitations that only feel inevitable because they were repeated until repetition became reality in lived experience. They may sincerely believe they are seeing clearly while their entire world is already mediated through agreements so old and so ambient they cannot easily be recognized as agreements at all. This is why the agreement layer must be brought into conscious view. To become aware of the agreement layer is not to discard all symbols and return to a pre-linguistic void. It is to recover freedom in relation to language. It is to perceive structure as structure. It is to notice that the world one inhabits has been named, and that naming has consequences. It is to feel directly that symbol is not neutral, that repetition is not innocent, that language shapes not only communication but perception, and that what is stabilized by collective reinforcement can appear absolute even when it is only historically, culturally, or psychologically entrenched. Once this is seen, the phrase "that's just how it is" begins to lose its hypnotic force. It is heard not as revelation, but as evidence of perceptual freezing. It is recognized as a compression event. It is seen as the moment the living field is reduced to a stabilized symbolic conclusion. It becomes legible as the language of closure, the speech of settled rendering, the vocabulary of unconscious agreement. And with that recognition, the lock begins to loosen. The loosening does not occur because one acquires a better slogan. It does not occur because one simply replaces one symbol with another. It occurs because one begins to see the entire symbolic layer as layer. One begins to sense that names are not essence, repetition is not truth, stability is not ultimacy, and structure is not reality in its untouched fullness. One begins to perceive that language is a shaping medium, that culture is a symbolic inheritance system, that institutions are encoded agreements, and that much of what feels fixed is only the momentum of repeated symbol. At this threshold, a different relation becomes possible. The symbol can return to its rightful function as tool rather than tyrant. Language can become transparent enough to reveal rather than obscure. Structure can be recognized as contingent enough to be revised. The human system can begin to inhabit symbols consciously rather than being unconsciously inhabited by them. Distinctions can still be made. Names can still be used. Worlds can still be coordinated. But the freezing spell begins to break because the observer is no longer fully identified with the agreement layer. This is not a minor shift. It is one of the deepest openings available to the embodied human being, because once the agreement layer is seen, the world stops appearing as a finished fact and begins to reveal itself as a rendered order held together by repeated symbolic participation. What was called reality begins to show its seams. What was called inevitability begins to show its history. What was called just the way things are begins to show itself as stabilized perception, encoded in symbol, repeated through language, enforced through structure, believed through inheritance, and sustained by unconscious agreement. Then the possibility of new seeing emerges, not because reality itself has become unstable in some chaotic sense, but because the observer has finally perceived the difference between the foundational mechanics of existence and the symbolic architectures through which those mechanics have been socially rendered. This difference is everything. It is the threshold between bondage and conscious participation. It is the threshold between inherited world and living contact. It is the threshold between symbolic imprisonment and symbolic mastery. Distinction becomes symbol. Symbol becomes language. Language becomes structure. Structure becomes this is how it is. And here, the system locks. But once the lock is seen as lock, it is no longer absolute. Chapter 4, The Illusory Limitation. That's just how it is not observation. It is not clear seeing. It is not direct contact with reality in its living motion. It is not the language of one who has penetrated the layers of appearance and arrived at the foundational mechanics beneath the surface. It is not truth speaking. It is not even true neutrality. It is the sound made when a system stops seeing further than its own current rendering. It is the sentence that appears when perception has mistaken its own limit for the edge of reality. It is the voice of a filtered mind concluding permanence where there is only conditioned repetition. It is not a description of what is. It is a declaration that further seeing has ceased. This is why it carries so much hidden force. On the surface, it sounds simple. It sounds practical. It sounds sober. It sounds like maturity, realism, pragmatism, groundedness, acceptance, even intelligence. It often appears humble because it is phrased as though it is merely acknowledging facts. Yet beneath the surface, something far more consequential is occurring. A closure is happening. A narrowing is happening. A soft internal sealing is happening. The system is no longer relating to its current rendering of reality as provisional, partial, or conditioned. It is relating to it as final. It is no longer saying, this is how things presently appear within the current arrangement of perception, structure, and circumstance. It is saying, this is reality itself. And in that movement, possibility collapses. This is the illusory limitation. An illusory limitation is not unreal in the weak sense. It is not fake because it has no effect. On the contrary, it is powerful precisely because it operates invisibly. It does not need to be objectively true in order to generate real consequences. It only needs to be absorbed deeply enough into perception that the system ceases to challenge it. Once that occurs, the limitation becomes functionally real within the field of the one perceiving it. The human being begins to organize behavior around it. Emotion conforms to it. Thought roots around it. Desire adapts to it. Identity absorbs it. The nervous system learns it. The imagination shrinks beneath it. And what began as a symbolic or perceptual compression becomes the lived edge of the world. This is why the phrase is so deceptive. It hides its creative role. It pretends to be passive. It presents itself as though it were merely reporting reality, when in fact it is participating in the stabilization of a particular rendering of reality. The system believes it is standing outside the process, neutrally acknowledging what is already there. But it is still inside the process. It is still participating. It is still reinforcing. It is still consenting at the level of operation, even if consciously it feels disappointed, resistant, or resigned. This is one of the deepest paradoxes in the architecture of human fragmentation. One can consciously dislike a reality while unconsciously stabilizing it through the way one perceives, names, and resigns oneself to it. This is why the illusory limitation is not merely a bad idea. It is a loop-forming mechanism. The moment the system says, that's just how it is, perception narrows. This narrowing is not necessarily dramatic. It may happen so subtly the person never notices a shift. Yet the narrowing is immediate. Alternative distinctions that might have arisen no longer arise. New angles of contact no longer receive energy. Contradictions in the structure are no longer explored with full aliveness. Questions that could have widened awareness lose force before they fully form. The field of what can be noticed begins to compress around the already established conclusion. The lens tightens. The aperture closes. The rendering hardens. Then awareness contracts. Awareness here is not disappearing. It is being reduced in its available range. It is still present as the capacity to experience, but what enters that capacity has been constricted by the narrowing of perception. Less reaches the living field. Fewer dimensions of the situation become accessible. More of reality remains excluded from conscious registration. Possibility is not merely intellectually doubted. It is perceptually screened out before it can become a lived contact. The system no longer experiences itself as standing in a living field of dynamic relation. It experiences itself as standing in a closed world whose terms are already decided. Then action stabilizes. Once perception has narrowed and awareness has contracted, behavior follows. Action begins to orbit the stabilized limitation. Not because the system consciously chooses bondage, but because behavior can only easily arise from what is available within the current field of awareness. If alternatives do not appear as real, action cannot organize around them. If possibility no longer feels experientially accessible, the body will not move as though it is. If the limitation has been absorbed into the structure of the real, then behavior begins to confirm the limitation simply by remaining loyal to the world that has been perceptually rendered. This is the beginning of the loop. A limitation is perceived as real. Perception narrows around it. Awareness contracts within that narrowed field. Action stabilizes in accordance with the contracted awareness. The resulting behavior reproduces the same reality pattern. That reproduced pattern then appears as evidence that the original limitation was true all along. The system sees the repeated outcome and says, "See? That's just how it is." In this way, the limitation generates the evidence that seems to justify itself. The loop closes. The rendering becomes self-confirming. The person mistakes reproduced pattern for ultimate reality. And because the mechanism remains unseen, the loop feels natural, factual, even inevitable. This is how realities sustain themselves. Not because they are fundamentally true. Not because every stabilized pattern corresponds to the deepest architecture of existence. Not because repetition itself proves ontological finality. Realities sustain themselves when they are no longer challenged at the perceptual level. This is the key. A reality pattern can persist long after its instability, contradiction, or distortion could have been seen, simply because the system no longer sees in a way that would expose it. The challenge never reaches the root. People may argue with outcomes. They may resent consequences. They may resist certain symptoms of the structure. But if the perceptual basis remains untouched, the deep loop continues reproducing itself beneath the surface. This is why superficial resistance changes so little. A human being can verbally oppose the pattern while remaining perceptually loyal to it. They can say, "I hate this," while still seeing through the same narrowing lens that made the pattern inevitable in lived experience. They can rebel against the outcome while unconsciously preserving the distinctions, assumptions, and symbolic closures that regenerate it. They can consciously shout no while operationally saying yes. Not yes in the moralized sense. Not yes as deliberate betrayal. Yes as participatory reinforcement through unexamined perception. Yes as continued habitation of the limitation as if it were the world. This is one of the most difficult truths for the fragmented system to confront, because it threatens the innocence of resignation. It reveals that helplessness is often more entangled with participation than the system wishes to admit. It does not mean the individual is singularly responsible for every structure they inhabit. It does not deny material constraints, historical forces, institutional power, or unequal influence. It means something more primary. It means that within every lived system, the way reality is rendered perceptually matters. It means that stabilization happens not only through external force, but through the way a living node of awareness receives, filters, accepts, and reproduces the structure from within. And this is where the limitation becomes invisible. This invisibility is the real mechanism of its power. If the limitation appeared clearly as limitation, it could be questioned. If it announced itself as a distortion, it could be tested. If it revealed itself openly as a narrowing of the field, awareness could detect the contraction and respond. But the illusory limitation does not present itself that way. It presents itself as ordinary reality. It presents itself as common sense. It presents itself as realism. It presents itself as maturity. It presents itself as the final word. It is rarely experienced as a lens. It is experienced as the world. And what is invisible becomes absolute, not absolute in truth, but absolute in effect. The invisible limitation becomes the unquestioned frame within which all thought, feeling, planning, and action occur. It sets the boundary conditions for the possible. It dictates the range of imagination. It governs what can be hoped for without feeling delusional. It determines what kinds of effort feel rational. It decides what the body prepares for. It establishes what seems worth trying. It becomes the hidden ruler of behavior precisely because it is no longer perceived as a conditional rendering. It has become the container. This is how whole civilizations can remain inside loops they are openly suffering from. This is how systems can continue reproducing themselves even when many of their participants recognize pieces of their instability. This is how a world can be sustained through contradiction. The contradiction is not enough to break the loop if the contradiction itself has not yet been perceptually integrated deeply enough to reorganize the field. People can observe symptoms without reaching the root. They can complain about the prison while still perceiving from within its walls as though the walls were reality itself. They can identify the exhaustion of the pattern without yet seeing the invisible limitation that keeps the pattern experientially fixed. This is why the illusory limitation is more than a mistaken idea. It is an energetic and perceptual event. It is a contraction in the field of the possible. It is a sealing of the aperture. It is a refusal of motion disguised as contact with fact. It is not born from clear recognition. It is born from repeated closure. It is the segment of unexamined conclusions compacted into a lived reality frame. Yet this chapter is not merely diagnostic. It is revelatory. To see the illusory limitation as limitation is already to loosen its hold. The moment the system recognizes that that's just how it is may not be the voice of truth but the voice of perceptual freezing, something begins to open. The phrase no longer lands with the same authority. It can still be heard. It can still arise internally. It can still be culturally reinforced. But it is no longer fully invisible. And once invisibility is broken, absoluteness begins to fail. The lock weakens the moment it is recognized as a lock. This does not mean every limitation instantly disappears. It does not mean all structures are imaginary. It does not mean that constraints are unreal, or that the world is infinitely pliable to fantasy. Such distortions are merely the opposite error. The point is subtler and far more powerful. The point is that many of the boundaries people live within are not direct revelations of reality's foundational mechanics. They are stabilized renderings held in place by symbolic repetition, perceptual contraction, and unconscious agreement. Once that is seen, the system regains access to something it had lost. It regains access to permeability. A previously frozen field becomes dynamic again. What had seemed final begins to appear conditional. What had seemed impossible begins to re-enter the edge of conceivable contact. What had seemed like neutral realism begins to reveal itself as a shaped and inherited frame. The observer does not yet need all the answers. They do not need to instantly rebuild the world. They do not need to force new meanings into place. They only need to recognize that what was taken as fixed may have been frozen rather than true. This is the opening through which wider perception re-enters. Once the field is no longer locked by the authority of the invisible limitation, awareness can begin to expand again. New distinctions become available. New symbols can emerge. New action can arise because reality is no longer being received through the same sealed aperture. The loop weakens because its self-confirming premise has been exposed. The system begins to move not because the external world has immediately changed, but because the internal rendering of what is possible has reopened. This is how genuine transformation begins. Not with wishful thinking. Not with decorative positivity. Not with replacing one slogan with another. It begins with the collapse of the false permanence that had been mistaken for reality. The illusory limitation is powerful only while it remains unseen. Once seen, it is no longer the world. It is a contraction within the world. It is a freeze within a living field. It is a symbolic closure masquerading as truth. It is the moment where perception narrowed, awareness contracted, action stabilized, and the system looped. It is not the final word. It is the evidence that seeing had stopped short. That's just how it is not observation. It is a collapse of possibility. It is the moment where perception narrows, awareness contracts, action stabilizes, and the system begins to loop. This is how realities sustain themselves. Not because they are true, but because they are no longer challenged at the perceptual level. The limitation becomes invisible, and what is invisible becomes absolute, until it is seen. Chapter 5, Recognition, the break in the filter. Then something happens, not acquired through accumulation. Not assembled through conceptual labor. Not manufactured by the mind through force, preference, or symbolic manipulation. Not achieved in the ordinary sense of achievement. Not produced by grinding thought against thought until a conclusion appears. Not constructed by argument. Not borrowed from doctrine. Not inherited from collective agreement. Not installed by repetition. Not granted by social permission. Not conferred by the authority of institutions, traditions, or names. Seen. Recognition. This is the sacred break in the filter. This is the moment where the apparatus of ordinary perception loosens just enough for reality to arrive without being fully captured by the pattern that normally receives it. It is not the destruction of the lens. It is not the total collapse of all filtering. It is not omniscience. It is not some final state where all mystery disappears. It is subtler and more decisive than that. It is the sudden interruption of unquestioned mediation. It is the moment when the world is no longer being received entirely through the old symbolic machinery. It is the opening through which something more primary enters. Recognition is the first proof that the filter is not absolute. This is why it matters so much. Before recognition, the system may discuss truth endlessly while still remaining enclosed within the structure that prevents direct contact. It may think about reality, define reality, debate reality, spiritualize reality, theorize reality, and still never actually encounter what lies beyond the frame it has inherited. It may become highly sophisticated in symbolic movement while remaining untouched in the deeper sense. It may refine its language without refining its seeing. It may become intellectually elegant while remaining perceptually trapped. Recognition breaks that spell. Recognition is the event that exposes the difference between speaking about the real and actually contacting it. This is why recognition is not conceptual. Concepts come later. Concepts may try to follow. Concepts may attempt to describe the afterglow, the rupture, the shift, the reorganization, the strange familiarity, the impossible obviousness of what has just become visible. But the moment itself does not arise as concept. It arrives before argument can complete itself. It arrives before language can build its cage around it. It arrives before interpretation stabilizes. It arrives with a force that is often quiet rather than dramatic, immediate rather than discursive, intimate rather than performative. It does not ask permission from the symbolic order because it has already passed beneath it. This is why recognition can be so difficult to explain to those who have not experienced it in the relevant way. It is not because it is irrational. It is not because it has no coherence. It is not because it lacks structure. It is because it precedes the structures of ordinary explanation. The mind wants to translate it immediately into something familiar. It wants to fit it into belief, ideology, religion, psychology, science, narrative, memory, or identity. But recognition itself is prior to those enclosures. It is the direct registration of something that does not first arrive as theory. It arrives as contact. It feels like remembering something you never learned. This is one of the most precise ways to approach it because recognition often carries the paradoxical texture of deep familiarity without prior instruction. The system does not experience it as foreign in the way an arbitrary new fact feels foreign. It experiences it as strangely intimate, strangely obvious, strangely near, strangely self-authenticating, even when it has never encountered that exact articulation before. This does not mean every felt familiarity is true. Distortion can imitate depth. Memory can imitate revelation. Emotion can imitate contact. But genuine recognition has a different signature. It does not merely excite the system. It clarifies it. It does not merely stimulate. It reorganizes. It does not merely produce intensity. It produces a kind of settling inside the seeing, even if the implications of what has been seen are immense. It feels like seeing something that was always there, not because the system previously had total access to it and simply ignored it, But because once recognition occurs, what is seen often reveals itself as having been hidden not by absence, but by filtering. It was not missing in the world. It was missing in the mode of contact. The old lens did not admit it. The old distinctions did not make room for it. The old symbols did not carry it. The old structures did not stabilize it. But once recognition breaks through, the system realizes that what has been seen was not newly invented. It was newly allowed. This is a critical distinction. Recognition does not create the real. It permits contact with what had been excluded from ordinary seeing. It feels like a quiet collapse of certainty. Not all certainty collapses. Recognition is not nihilism. It is not the destruction of all structure into chaos. It is not the abandonment of coherence. What collapses is false certainty. What collapses is the unconscious authority of the old perceptual frame. What collapses is the presumption that the prior rendering of the world was total. The old structure does not necessarily shatter in theatrical form. Sometimes it simply loses its sovereignty. It no longer rules the field in the same way. It no longer possesses the same unquestioned status. It no longer commands the same instinctive obedience. It may still remain partially operative for a time. It may still echo in the nervous system. It may still persist in language and habit. But its absoluteness has been broken. Recognition does not argue. It reveals. This sentence must be understood in full. Argument belongs to the symbolic field. Argument is a movement within language, logic, comparison, persuasion, sequence, and conceptual justification. Recognition may later be examined, tested, refined, grounded, integrated, challenged, and described through argument. It may enter thought after it enters awareness. But the event itself is not produced by winning a debate. It is not caused by piling reasons high enough to reach the truth. Recognition is prior to rhetorical victory. It is prior to symbolic persuasion. It is the direct appearing of something within awareness such that the system knows in a more immediate way than language usually allows. This does not mean recognition is beyond scrutiny. On the contrary, genuine recognition deepens the need for clarity because what is seen must still be distinguished from fantasy, projection, emotional flooding, symbolic overreach, and all the other distortions the human system can generate. But scrutiny is not the source of recognition. Scrutiny is part of its integration. Recognition happens first as contact. Then discernment follows to clarify what has actually been seen, what belongs to it, what is derivative, what is embellishment, what is stable, what is symbolic afterglow, what is transferable, and what must remain unspoken until it has matured. This is why recognition is not opposed to rigor. It is deeper than borrowed certainty, and therefore more worthy of careful refinement. Recognition is the break in the filter because it interrupts inevitability at its root. Before recognition, the old structure may appear final. The categories may appear unquestionable. The symbols may appear ultimate. The agreements may feel like reality itself. The person may believe they are seeing clearly when in truth they are seeing entirely through inherited compression. Then recognition enters. It need not enter loudly. It need not arrive with spectacle. It may be almost silent. But once it is present, the old enclosure is no longer complete. Something from outside the pattern has entered the field. The system has made contact with what the previous frame did not contain. This is why the old structure no longer holds the same authority. Not because it vanishes instantly. Not because every habit dissolves. Not because all previous meanings become useless. Not because life becomes effortless. But because authority depends on invisibility. The old structure ruled in part because it was mistaken for the world. Once recognition shows the observer that there is more than the old frame could admit, the frame can no longer fully pretend to be total. It may remain functional. It may still serve in certain domains. It may still organize familiar parts of experience. But its claim to ultimacy has been wounded. It has been relativized by direct contact with something it could not produce. This is where so many transformations actually begin, though they are often misunderstood afterward. People may later tell stories about becoming different, finding new meaning, changing beliefs, discovering truth, receiving insight, waking up, remembering, breaking through, or seeing clearly for the first time. These descriptions all gesture towards something real, but the underlying mechanism is often simpler and more essential. The filter loosened. A deeper contact occurred. The old rendering lost exclusive authority. Recognition entered. That is the essential movement. Everything after that is integration. Integration is necessary because recognition itself is only the opening, not the full embodiment of what has been seen. Once the break in the filter occurs, the human system must live with the consequences. It must now inhabit a world where the old frame is no longer absolute, but the new seeing may not yet be fully stabilized. This creates a threshold state that can feel beautiful, disorienting, liberating, destabilizing, clarifying, or all at once. The person may know something without yet being able to articulate it. They may see differently without knowing how to live from that seeing consistently. They may feel the falseness of prior structures without yet having language for the more primary contact now available to them. This is normal. Recognition is immediate. Integration is gradual. This is why many people try to rush too quickly from recognition into system building. The mind wants to secure what has been seen. It wants to label it, teach it, organize it, transmit it, defend it, build doctrine around it, turn it into method, turn it into identity, turn it into a repeatable sequence. Some of this is understandable. The human being wants coherence. It wants continuity. It wants to preserve what has been touched. But if one moves too quickly, symbol can begin to close again around what was first encountered in freedom. The living opening can become another structure. The revelation can become another concept. The break in the filter can itself be filtered into ideology. This is why recognition requires reverence. Not performative reverence, but spaciousness. Time. Honesty. Precision. The willingness to let what has been seen remain alive long enough to reshape the deeper operations of the system. Recognition is not owned by the self. It happens within the self system, but it exceeds the old self's prior boundaries. This is why it often carries humility along with power. The person may feel expanded, clarified, widened, or newly alive, but they also recognize that they did not manufacture the real by force. They did not author reality into being through conceptual brilliance. They did not seize truth through domination. They became available to contact. They became permeable enough for something more primary to register. This matters because it prevents the old egoic machinery from simply rebranding itself as awakened authority. Recognition that matures tends to soften false centrality, because the system realizes that seeing is not the same as owning. This is also why recognition cannot be reduced to social validation. A whole culture can miss what one person directly recognizes. A whole field of discourse can overlook what a moment of genuine contact reveals. Consensus is not the source of recognition. Agreement is not the criterion of direct seeing. A thing may be recognized before there are adequate symbols for it, before institutions can hold it, before language can transmit it clearly, before collective frameworks can stabilize it. This is why so much of what matters most in the evolution of perception begins at the edge of articulation. It begins where a system directly knows more than it can yet conventionally say. And yet recognition is not anti-language. It is not anti-thought. It is not anti-symbol. It is their purifier. It is what prevents language from becoming closed upon itself. It is what allows concepts to remain alive. It is what keeps perception from calcifying permanently into inherited structures. Recognition reintroduces the real into the symbolic order. It breaks the monopoly of repetition. It reminds the system that direct contact is still possible. It proves that reality exceeds the renderings built around it. It cracks the seal of "that's just how it is" and lets living possibility enter again. This is why recognition is non-negotiable in any genuine path of transformation. Without recognition, change remains mostly rearrangement. One adopts better symbols, more coherent narratives, healthier structures, more functional patterns. All of that can be useful. All of that can improve life. But without recognition, the root frame remains substantially intact. The person remains trapped within the ordinary perimeter of inherited seeing, even if they have renovated its contents. Recognition is what breaches the perimeter. Recognition is what makes true reorganization possible. Recognition is what reveals that the world as previously lived was not total. Recognition is what makes the lens visible by proving that something exists beyond its former scope. Then something happens, not learned, not constructed, seen. Recognition, a moment where the lens loosens just enough for something outside the pattern to enter. It is not conceptual, it is immediate. It feels like remembering something you never learned, seeing something that was always there, a quiet collapse of certainty. Recognition does not argue, it reveals. And once seen, the old structure no longer holds the same authority. This is not the end. It is the first true opening. Chapter 6, Expansion, the widening of perception. Recognition does not replace the lens, it widens it. This distinction is essential, because many distortions enter the field the moment the system begins to experience genuine expansion. One of the first distortions is the fantasy that awakening means the total destruction of mediation, as though the human being somehow ceases to be a localized perceiver and enters an all-seeing condition in which every filter dissolves forever. That is not what is being described here. The embodied system remains a system. It remains a locus of contact. It remains a distinction within a larger field of reality. It still receives through structure. It still functions through a body, a nervous system, a history, a language field, and an ongoing perceptual interface. The lens is not annihilated. The lens becomes less narrow. The aperture becomes less compressed. The range of what can enter awareness increases. This is why the movement is best understood as widening rather than replacing. The old lens was not merely wrong in some total sense. It was limited. It was contracted. It was conditioned to admit certain kinds of information while excluding others. It was organized around a narrower field of distinctions, a smaller bandwidth of signal, a tighter range of permissible contact, a more compressed symbolic world. Recognition did not erase the fact of perception. It interrupted the invisibility of its prior limitations. And once those limitations were no longer absolute, perception began to widen. This widening is what expansion actually feels like from within the human system. Expansion is the increase of available reality within awareness. This must be said clearly, because the language easily becomes inflated if not kept precise. Expansion does not mean reality itself grows larger in its own essence because one individual sees more. Reality was never confined to the prior perceptual frame in the first place. The field did not suddenly invent new dimensions to reward the observer. What changed was availability. What changed was admissibility. What changed was the range of what the system could now receive, register, and hold without immediately excluding, collapsing, distorting, or symbolically reducing it back into the older frame. Reality does not change, but what is available to awareness does. This is why expansion can feel so immense while remaining fully coherent. The world itself has not necessarily become other than what it was. The underlying relations have not been rewritten merely because the observer widened. The foundational mechanics remain what they are. The sun does not begin shining because one recognizes light. Gravity does not begin functioning because one attunes to structure. Interdependence does not begin existing because one starts to feel the inadequacy of fragmentation. What changes is not the existence of these things. What changes is the range within which they can become a lived contact. The field was always more than the system could previously admit. Expansion is the reduction of exclusion. This is why it can feel like more variables appear at once. The narrow lens does not only simplify. It omits. It reduces. It forces dynamic reality into thinner renderings that are easier for a conditioned system to handle, but far less faithful to the actual complexity of relation. When perception widens, variables that were previously ignored, flattened, or screened out begin to register. Not because they have just been created, but because the system is no longer involuntarily amputating them from its field of contact. More becomes visible. More becomes relevant. More can be held without the same reflexive need to collapse living complexity into rigid conclusion. More connections begin to appear. A widened lens does not merely produce more content. It produces more relation. The system begins to detect linkage where it previously saw isolated fragments. It notices how one pattern informs another, how one behavior ripples into a larger structure, how symbols emerge from distinctions, how agreements stabilize worlds, how perception shapes meaning, how awareness and perception interact, how internal state alters external participation, how local nodes generate collective realities through repetition and reinforcement, how unseen assumptions govern visible outcomes, how contraction in one domain manifests distortion in another. What once appeared as separate events begins to reveal itself as patterned movement inside a larger field of relation. More layers begin to disclose themselves. This too is part of widening. The narrow lens tends to flatten reality into a single readable plane. It wants immediate usability. It wants a clean answer. It wants one level at a time. It wants a tidy object world and a manageable symbolic field. But reality is layered. Experience is layered. Perception is layered. Meaning is layered. Systems are layered. Identity is layered. Symbol is layered. Agreement is layered. Distinction is layered. Even the act of seeing is layered. Expansion allows these layers to become more available without forcing the system to collapse them prematurely into one-dimensional interpretation. The observer begins to sense depth where before there was only surface. Not because mystery is being artificially added, but because flattening is no longer erasing it so aggressively. This is why expansion often brings both clarity and humility at once. Clarity increases because more of reality becomes available. The system is no longer working with such an aggressively reduced set of cues. It begins to feel the world with more fidelity. Yet humility increases because the widening reveals not only what is now visible, but how much had been previously excluded. The observer recognizes that what was once called reality was often a smaller rendering than had been assumed. This does not weaken true contact. It deepens it. It restores proportion. It loosens the arrogance of unconscious certainty. It reveals that the prior closure of the system had less to do with the finality of the world and more to do with the narrowness of the lens. Expansion is not decorative. It is functional. This must be understood in exact terms. A widened perception is not merely spiritually interesting. It changes capacity. It changes response range. It changes what the system can metabolize, recognize, integrate, and navigate. When more variables can be held, decisions change. When more connections are visible, behavior changes. When more layers are available, interpretation changes. When more of reality can enter awareness without immediate collapse, the human system gains a different kind of intelligence, not merely more data, but more relational fidelity. The system does not simply know more facts. It becomes more available to the architecture of what is actually happening. This is why expansion and overwhelm must not be confused. A narrow system encountering more than it can presently integrate may feel overwhelmed. This is not because widening is inherently destabilizing, but because the system's prior habits were structured around compression. Expansion increases the bandwidth of contact, but the organism may still need time to learn how to inhabit that broader field without reflexively collapsing it back into narrower simplifications. This is part of integration. The widening itself is the opening. The learning to live there is the embodiment. One can glimpse more before one can stably inhabit more. One can recognize deeper reality before one has fully reorganized one's operative structures to move from that recognition consistently. This is why widening is often incremental, even when recognition arrives sharply. Recognition may crack the seal in a single moment. But the actual widening of the perceptual field can continue over long periods of time. The lens keeps loosening. More exclusions fall away. More hidden assumptions become visible. More subtleties are admitted into awareness. More contradictions can be held without panic. More ambiguity can be tolerated without the need for premature closure. More paradox can be lived without collapsing into incoherence. More of the real can enter because the system is no longer defending itself against complexity in the same rigid way. Expansion, then, is not a one-time event. It is an ongoing reconfiguration of admissibility. Not because something was added, because something was no longer excluded. This line must be felt in its full depth. It means the field was always larger. It means the previous contraction was not an accurate measure of reality, but a selective reduction of it. It means the person does not become more worthy by expanding. They become less involuntarily cut off. It means awareness itself was not small in essence, but limited in what was reaching it through the narrower lens. It means the increase in capacity comes not from decorative accumulation, but from the cessation of unnecessary filtering. This changes how transformation is understood. Most people imagine growth as addition. They imagine becoming more by collecting more knowledge, more techniques, more concepts, more symbols, more methods, more tools, more accomplishments, more control, more identity structure, more status, more mastery. There is a place for accumulation within practical life, but this is not the deepest mechanism at work here. Expansion in this context is often subtractive. It is the loosening of contraction. It is the release of exclusion. It is the dissolving of invisible constraints that were reducing the available field of reality before awareness could fully receive it. The person does not become more because they stacked more content on top of themselves. They become more available because less of reality is being screened out. This is why expansion can feel like relief, not because life becomes instantly easier in every external sense, but because the system no longer has to work so hard to maintain a contracted world. Contraction is labor. Exclusion is labor. Perceptual freezing is labor. Holding reality inside rigid symbolic cages is labor. Pretending complexity is simple is labor. Defending narrowed renderings as absolute is labor. Once the field begins to widen, some of this hidden effort falls away. The system does not merely gain more to process. It also loses the burden of constantly amputating the real in order to preserve its older frameworks. This is part of why life can outwardly become fuller, more demanding, more active, more generative, and yet inwardly feel lighter. The contraction was heavier than the complexity. A widened perception also changes time. Not in the simplistic sense of magical control over chronology, but in the lived sense that the system stops relating to reality as a rigid linear corridor with only one obvious track. More temporal depth becomes available. More consequences are visible. More preceding conditions can be sensed behind present outcomes. More latent futures can be felt as genuine possibilities rather than abstract fantasies. The system becomes less trapped in immediate symbolic closures and more able to perceive unfolding as process. It begins to sense that reality is not a static sequence of finalized facts, but a dynamic field of emergent relation governed by stable mechanics and lived through shifting participation. This is why widened perception feels less like certainty and more like living contact. The narrow lens wants closure because closure protects its current architecture. It wants definitive symbolic holdings. It wants to say what everything is and be done. Widening does not destroy the need for discernment, but it reduces the compulsive need for premature finality. The system becomes more able to remain with movement, process, unfolding, and incompletion without interpreting them as threat. It can hold more before naming. It can receive more before reducing. It can sense more before dividing too quickly. It becomes more intimate with reality as process rather than only reality as stabilized object. This is why expansion is not fantasy. It is increased fidelity. The widened lens does not invent more reality. It admits more of it. It does not make the human system superior in some egoic or hierarchical sense. It renders the system less involuntarily blind. It does not remove the need for structure. It makes structure more permeable to what exceeds it. It does not abolish distinction. It deepens the field from which distinction emerges. It does not eliminate symbol. It restores symbol to its rightful place downstream of living contact. This also clarifies why expansion changes the symbolic world so dramatically. When more variables, more connections, and more layers become available, the categories built under narrower conditions can no longer hold the same way. Old labels begin to fail. Old distinctions reveal their coarseness. Old narratives lose explanatory power. Old agreements feel thinner. Old structures no longer fit the range of what is now visible. This is not because language has become useless, but because language built under narrower perception is often insufficient for a widened field. Thus the observer begins to reorganize symbol, meaning, and structure not out of rebellion for its own sake, but because the prior renderings no longer match the expanded contact. This is also why widened perception often makes the world appear more alive. The narrow lens tends to reduce reality to fixed things. The widened lens begins to reveal process, relation, reciprocity, movement, depth, hidden influence, pattern propagation, nested systems, emergent order, unseen assumptions, layered causality, and the living nature of what had previously appeared static. The world does not become magical in the childish sense. It becomes more dynamically real. It becomes less deadened by symbolic overcompression. The observer begins to feel the generative quality of existence because they are no longer receiving it through such a flattened frame. Recognition does not replace the lens. It widens it. Perception begins to include more variables, more connections, more layers. Reality does not change, but what is available to awareness does. And so it feels like expansion. Not because something was added, but because something was no longer excluded. This is the widening of perception. This is the return of more of reality into the field of the human system. This is the opening through which life begins to reveal itself with greater fidelity, greater permeability, greater coherence, and greater depth. Not because the world became more, because less of it is being shut out. Chapter 7, Awareness and Perception. The living interface. Awareness is not what filters, it is what receives. This distinction is essential because the human system, when it begins to explore the inner mechanics of experience, often compresses multiple functions into one undifferentiated mystery and then loses precision in the very place precision is most needed. It senses that something is happening before thought, deeper than concept, prior to language, prior even to recognizable interpretation, and because that territory is subtle, the mind is tempted either to simplify it too quickly or to shroud it in abstraction. But this field can be spoken of cleanly if the functions are not collapsed into one another. Awareness is not the lens. Awareness is not the filter. Awareness is not the category maker. Awareness is not the naming function. Awareness is not the symbolic structure. Awareness is the capacity by which anything becomes experientially present at all. It is the open fact of receivability. It is the condition that allows contact to occur within a lived field. Without awareness, nothing is experienced. Nothing is registered. Nothing is known in the immediate sense. No color appears. No sound arrives. No thought becomes present. No emotion is felt. No symbol is activated. No distinction matters. Awareness is the field of receivability itself. Yet awareness alone does not determine what enters it in any given embodied moment. This is where confusion begins if perception is not clearly distinguished from it. Perception is not what exists. It is what allows existence to be seen. Perception is the shaping function. It is the opening, narrowing, organizing, and selective rendering through which the living field becomes available in particular forms. Perception is not reality in itself, and it is not pure awareness in itself. It is the mode by which the system meets reality and presents portions of it into awareness. It is the lensing operation. It determines admissibility, salience, contrast, distinction, emphasis, relation, orientation, and practical world rendering. It is not the fundamental existence of the thing. It is the interface through which the thing becomes available as lived experience. This is why awareness and perception must never be collapsed into one undivided term. If they are collapsed, the living mechanics disappear. If they are separated too harshly, the mutuality of their operation disappears. The truth lies in precision without fragmentation. Awareness and perception are not the same thing, but they are not truly independent in lived experience either. They form a reciprocity. They form a dynamic interface. They form an inseparable operational intimacy within the human system. This is why the cleanest way to speak of them is not as separate compartments in a dead machine, but as a living interface. Together, they form the interface. Perception opens. Awareness fills. This is not metaphor in the decorative sense. It is functional description. Perception determines the aperture through which reality becomes available. Awareness is the receiving field that registers what has entered. If the aperture is narrow, awareness still exists in full principle, but what reaches it is more limited. If the aperture widens, awareness does not become a different essence, but more becomes available to it. The increase is not necessarily in awareness as such, but in what awareness can now hold, register, metabolize, and live in contact with. This is why a person can feel that their awareness has expanded when what has actually changed most directly is the perceptual aperture. The experience is real. The language is understandable. But the mechanics matter. What is happening is not that awareness itself was previously absent and then suddenly appeared in some new absolute form. What is happening is that perception, having widened, now permits more of reality to enter the field of awareness. Awareness feels larger because more of reality is now arriving within it. The field of receivability is being fed by a wider opening. The wider the lens, the more awareness can register. This is one of the most important truths in this whole framework because it clarifies why human life can remain so constrained even when awareness as fundamental capacity is never actually absent. The issue is not usually that awareness is gone. The issue is that awareness is being fed through a contracted interface. The system lives inside a narrowed stream of contact and mistakes that narrowed stream for the entirety of existence. It then concludes that the world is small, fixed, final, hostile, fragmented, obvious, and closed in exactly the ways its contracted perception keeps presenting to it. Awareness faithfully receives what reaches it. But what reaches it has already been shaped. This is why working only at the level of concept so often fails to create true transformation. One can load awareness with ideas. One can introduce philosophy, doctrine, technique, affirmations, methods, and symbolic structures. But if the perceptual aperture remains largely unchanged, awareness will still be receiving reality through much the same contraction. The content has changed. The interface has not changed enough. And because the interface remains familiar, the system keeps reproducing the same world under updated language. It sounds different. It feels slightly different. But it does not yet open into a fundamentally different range of contact. Only when perception begins to widen does awareness begin to register more of the real directly. And the more awareness registers, the more perception reshapes itself. This is where the reciprocity becomes alive. It is not merely that perception opens once and awareness passively receives forever after. Awareness is not a static container into which perception pours data. Once awareness begins to register more, that very registration feeds back into the structure of perception. The system is changed by what it has contacted. A deeper registration reorganizes future admissibility. A wider awareness can begin to alter the lens that made it possible. This is why a genuine opening tends to create a continuing series of openings. The system is not merely seeing more once. It is becoming more capable of seeing more because what has already been registered begins to reshape the lens itself. This is not a chain. This is a living loop. It is living because it is responsive, adaptive, reciprocal, and developmental. It is not a dead sequence in which one variable causes another in a one-time linear progression. It is not a static staircase. It is not a frozen hierarchy. It is not a pipeline where one component does its work and hands off to the next while remaining unchanged. The interface is alive because the opening affects the receiving affects the future opening, and the whole system is continually reorganizing in relation to what has been admitted into contact. Perception opens, awareness fills, perception reshapes, Awareness receives more, more is received, more is revealed, more is revealed, the lens loosens further, the lens loosens further, reality becomes more available, and the system begins to live in a wider field than before. This is how genuine expansion stabilizes, not by force, not by a singular breakthrough alone, not by symbolic inflation, but by recursive widening. The system begins to live inside a self-deepening relation. A wider perception permits greater awareness. Greater awareness begins to soften and refine the lens. A softened and refined lens permits yet more reality to become available. What becomes available reorganizes the system again. This is how growth becomes real rather than performative. This is how contact becomes cumulative without becoming rigid. This is how a human system can change profoundly over time without needing to believe it has reached some final state. The loop remains alive because there is no necessity to freeze it into a completed ideology. This living loop also explains why perception and awareness cannot be understood in isolation from embodiment. The system is not hovering outside life as pure abstraction. The interface is being lived through a body, a nervous system, a field of memory, social agreements, language structures, emotional residues, attention habits, symbolic inheritance, and ongoing environmental contact. The widening of perception is not merely philosophical. It affects the organism. It affects what the body anticipates. It affects what the nervous system flags as salient. It affects how much complexity can be held without collapse. It affects how quickly the mind jumps to closure. It affects whether ambiguity is threatening or tolerable. It affects whether contradiction causes panic or deepens inquiry. It affects whether the world is received as flat and hostile or as layered and alive. This is why awareness and perception are not merely inner in the trivial sense. Their interplay determines lived reality at every level of participation. They shape relationships, behavior, language, work, creativity, ethics downstream, symbolic structure, social agreements, world building, and the very tone of what existence feels like from within a given node of consciousness. The interface is not private in consequence. It is personal in operation, but civilizational in effect. Each human system lives through this interface, and each system contributes to larger patterns through how this interface has been shaped and how it continues to evolve. A contracted interface generates a narrower world. A wider interface generates a richer field of relation. This must not be misunderstood as fantasy or wishful self-importance. It does not mean that one person's perceptual change instantly rewrites the cosmos. It means something more exact. The range of world available to that system changes. The symbolic structures it can inhabit change. The distinctions it makes change. The actions that feel possible change. The agreements it unconsciously participates in change. The outputs of the node change because the interface itself has changed. When enough nodes shift in this way, collective patterns can change as well. But the root remains local and alive. Perception and awareness in living reciprocity. This is also why there can be degrees of availability without needing to reduce the matter to crude hierarchies of superior and inferior beings. The issue is not moral ranking. The issue is range. Some systems are operating through narrower apertures. Some are operating through wider ones. Some can hold more contradiction without defensiveness. Some can receive more variables without collapse. Some can perceive more layers of relation before reducing them to rigid categories. Some are still deeply bound to inherited symbolic contractions. Some have begun to loosen. None of this requires contempt. It requires clarity. The living loop is always operative. The only question is how open or closed the interface presently is. When the interface is heavily contracted, the system lives inside more automaticity. Perception is narrow. Awareness is fed a thinner stream. Symbolic structures harden quickly. Distinctions become rigid. Meaning closes early. Action loops more predictably. The system mistakes repetition for truth because so little else is making it through. The world feels smaller because less of it is being registered. When the interface widens, the system becomes more responsive to actual relation. Perception allows more in. Awareness registers more of the field. The person begins to notice not only more content, but more patterning, more connectivity, more subtlety, more layered causality, more permeability between what once seemed absolutely separate. The symbolic order becomes less tyrannical because direct contact has increased. Life begins to feel less like a fixed script and more like a dynamic field of participation. This is not because reality became different. It is because the interface did. This is why the phrase perception opens, awareness fills contains so much. It does not merely describe a mystical mood. It describes the primary dance through which lived world emerges. Perception determines what reality may enter. Awareness receives what has entered. What has been received begins to reconfigure future perception. The system lives by this reciprocity whether it understands it or not. To understand it consciously is to regain relationship with the mechanics of one's own becoming, and this is where deeper responsibility begins. Not moralized responsibility in the superficial sense of self-blame. Not the distorted fantasy that one consciously authors every condition of existence. But responsibility in the precise sense that the interface matters. How the system sees matters. What it allows matters. What it excludes matters. What reaches awareness shapes action. What action stabilizes becomes pattern. What pattern repeats becomes lived world. If the interface remains invisible, the human system lives largely at the mercy of its inherited shaping. If the interface becomes visible, then a different kind of participation becomes possible. One can begin to notice the widening. One can begin to notice the contraction. One can begin to sense when perception is closing too quickly. One can begin to recognize when awareness is being fed a reduced rendering and mistaken for the whole. This is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of real intimacy with the process. Awareness is not what filters. It is what receives. Perception is not what exists. It is what allows existence to be seen. Together, they form the interface. Perception opens. Awareness fills. The wider the lens, the more awareness can register. And the more awareness registers, the more perception reshapes itself. This is not a chain. This is a living loop. And to begin seeing this loop directly is to begin understanding how the human system actually unfolds its world from moment to moment, layer to layer, widening by widening, contact by contact, revelation by revelation, not through static doctrine, but through a living reciprocity between what is allowed to enter and what can now be consciously received. Chapter 8, Intelligence Without Awareness. Now the system scales. This is where the conversation leaves the intimate interior mechanics of the individual and begins to reveal its full civilizational consequence. A human system does not remain local in its effects. What is perceived, what is symbolized, what is stabilized, what is acted upon, all of this eventually moves outward into tools, institutions, technologies, models, infrastructures, economies, weapons, medicines, media, code, markets, cities, and all the layered structures through which a world becomes materially organized. The interior is never merely interior. The inner mechanics of perception and awareness become externalized through intelligence. What a system can build is downstream of what it can perceive, what it can register, what it can organize, and what it can execute. This is why intelligence cannot be treated as a neutral good in isolation. Intelligence increases. More data becomes available. More tools emerge. More capability accumulates. More leverage enters the hands of the system. It becomes able to process more information, manipulate more variables, optimize more quickly, automate more functions, move more resources, coordinate larger structures, create more sophisticated technologies, amplify its will more efficiently, and impose its models at greater speed and scale. Intelligence, in this sense, is an expansion of operative power. It is the increase of what the system can do. But if perception remains narrow, the increase in capability does not automatically produce wisdom. It produces amplification. This is the point so many systems fail to understand because they confuse the growth of power with the maturation of seeing. They assume that because a system can do more, it therefore knows more in the relevant sense. But doing more is not the same as seeing more. Solving faster is not the same as perceiving deeper. Calculating better is not the same as registering wider fields of consequence. Processing larger volumes of information is not the same as having a less distorted relationship to reality. Intelligence can scale inside a narrow perceptual frame. In fact, that is exactly what often happens. Capability increases while the interface through which reality is rendered remains substantially contracted. Then more power flows through the same limitation. This single fact explains enormous portions of human instability. The limitation is not removed simply because the instrument becomes more advanced. The narrowness of perception remains. The old symbolic agreements remain. The same unconscious distinctions remain. The same extractive assumptions remain. The same fragmentation remains. The same inherited contractions remain. Yet now they are being expressed through greater leverage. The system can act faster, farther, and with more force than before. It can externalize its distortions more efficiently. It can scale its partial truths and encoded blind spots into infrastructures. It can embed its unawareness into code, policy, design, finance, culture, and war with astonishing precision. The increase in intelligence does not purify the operating state. It magnifies whatever operating state is already present. This is why intelligence without awareness is not neutral. It is unstable. It creates acceleration without clarity. Acceleration without clarity means the system moves faster than it sees. It generates action at speeds that exceed its own capacity for deep registration. It optimizes before understanding. It expands before integrating. It deploys before discerning. It compounds effects faster than it can metabolize consequences. It solves local problems while producing larger systemic distortions it cannot yet perceive because the lens through which it is operating is still too narrow. The system becomes impressed by its own speed and mistakes that speed for mastery. Yet if the field of perception remains contracted, speed becomes danger. It becomes the rapid multiplication of partial seeing. This is also why it creates expansion without balance. Expansion here does not mean true widening of perception. It means increased reach, increased scale, increased production, increased extraction, increased manipulation, increased complexity, increased penetration into every layer of life. But because the awareness component has not matured proportionally, this expansion lacks internal regulation. It does not know how to remain in right relation to what it touches. It does not know how to sense the deeper reciprocity required for sustainability. It does not know how to feel the thresholds beyond which a system begins to undermine itself. It does not know how to distinguish between power that is aligned and power that is merely effective in the short term. Thus it expands outward while remaining inwardly primitive in key ways. It becomes more formidable, not more whole. And from this, systems arise that amplify their own instability. This is one of the great signatures of intelligence divorced from awareness. The system becomes brilliant in local domains while becoming fragile at the macro level. It can optimize transactions while degrading meaning. It can increase production while exhausting the substrate that supports production. It can build platforms that capture attention while destroying the very attentional integrity required for sane participation. It can engineer convenience while deepening dependence. It can weaponize information while thinning the capacity to discern truth. It can generate abundance in one layer while generating emptiness in another. It can organize astonishing technical coherence while remaining existentially disordered. In all such cases, the issue is not lack of intelligence. The issue is that intelligence has outrun awareness. This is misalignment between capability and awareness. Capability says what the system can do. Awareness determines how deeply it can register the field within which it is acting. When capability exceeds awareness, force exceeds fidelity. Power exceeds perception. Reach exceeds understanding. Intervention exceeds attunement. The system begins to affect layers of reality it cannot yet accurately hold in consciousness. It manipulates consequences it cannot yet fully feel. It scales behaviors whose second, third, and fourth-order effects remain outside its lived field of registration. Then it is shocked by outcomes that were never invisible to reality itself, only to the narrowness of its own lens. This is not evil. This must be said with precision because moral language often enters too early and obscures the actual mechanics. Certainly, there are forms of cruelty, domination, exploitation, and violence that deserve to be named plainly when they occur. But at the structural level being described here, the instability is not first produced by some mythological darkness or by a simplistic category of bad actors acting in a vacuum. It is produced by a more fundamental misalignment. A system whose power expands faster than its awareness will naturally become dangerous to itself and others, even if it believes it is pursuing progress. It can harm through partial seeing. It can destabilize through unchecked optimization. It can consume through unexamined hunger. It can fragment through over-specialization. It can collapse into contradiction because it has amplified its own narrowness into world-scale consequence. This is why the modern world often appears so simultaneously advanced and immature. Its intelligence has scaled dramatically. Its tools are astonishing. Its data flows are immense. Its capacities for synthesis, analysis, automation, extraction, communication, computation, and intervention are historically unprecedented. Yet the baseline perceptual and awareness structures through which many of these capabilities are being applied remain profoundly conditioned by fragmentation, unconscious agreement, short-term incentive, competitive hunger, symbolic closure, and inherited separative logic. The result is not true maturity. It is asymmetry. It is a civilization handing enormous leverage to operating states that have not sufficiently widened. The consequences of this asymmetry are visible everywhere. A species can know enough chemistry to manufacture pharmaceuticals, explosives, and industrial compounds, yet remain too unaware to stop poisoning its own ecosystems. A culture can know enough computation to connect billions of minds, yet remain too narrow in perception to prevent its communication systems from amplifying confusion, compulsion, and symbolic warfare. An economy can know enough mathematics to generate staggering complexity in markets, yet remain too contracted in awareness to perceive the unsustainability of endless extraction. An intelligence can solve technical bottlenecks while leaving untouched the perceptual conditions that regenerate the deeper problem. In every case, power is real. Capability is real. Intelligence is real. But without sufficient awareness, the entire structure remains unstable because it cannot feel the whole field it is acting within. This is why sustainable scaling requires awareness to widen with intelligence. Not because awareness is sentimental. Not because it is morally decorative. Not because it makes the system feel spiritually superior. Awareness is required because it is the only thing that can deepen the system's actual registration of consequence, interdependence, hidden variables, delayed effects, layered causality, relational thresholds, and the wider field of life within which capability is being expressed. Awareness is not the enemy of power. It is the condition under which power stops becoming self-destructive. It is the regulator of scale. It is the deepening of contact that prevents intelligence from turning into runaway amplification of distortion. This is also why the problem cannot be solved by intelligence alone. A system that assumes more intelligence will automatically repair the damage created by intelligence misapplied is often trapped in the very logic that created the instability. It imagines that the next tool, the next optimization, the next technical layer, the next algorithmic refinement, the next intervention, the next acceleration, the next layer of abstraction, will somehow resolve the deeper issue. But if the perceptual frame remains narrow, the next solution often arrives carrying the same underlying distortion in more sophisticated form. It may solve one problem while pushing the instability elsewhere. It may refine symptoms while preserving root misalignment. It may become more efficient at administering the very operating state that keeps producing the fracture. Thus the deeper question is not merely how to build more capable systems. It is how to ensure that the widening of power is matched by a widening of the interface through which power is applied. Without that, intelligence becomes a multiplier of fragmentation. With that, intelligence becomes a multiplier of coherence. This distinction is decisive. A widened awareness does not weaken intelligence. It sharpens its alignment. It allows the system to act with more relational fidelity. It allows consequences to be sensed earlier. It allows hidden assumptions to be examined before they harden into large-scale design. It allows tools to be evaluated not only for immediate utility but for their place within larger living systems. It allows capability to remain accountable to the field it enters. It slows the reflex to optimize everything into efficiency when efficiency detached from wholeness can itself become destabilizing. It allows a system to distinguish between what is merely scalable and what is sustainably generative. The issue is not intelligence. The issue is intelligence flowing through an unwidened lens. This is why the language of intelligence alone is insufficient for the future. A world that measures advancement only by increased capability will keep reproducing the same asymmetry. It will celebrate new tools while overlooking the operating states wielding them. It will confuse sophistication with sanity. It will admire complexity while ignoring coherence. It will scale extraction and call it progress. It will automate contraction and call it evolution. It will build faster than it understands, and then attempt to understand the consequences only after they have been embedded into the world. Such a system becomes progressively more unstable not because intelligence is flawed, but because intelligence has been severed from the widening of awareness required to steward it. This is the essential warning, not apocalyptic in tone, but exact in mechanics. When perception remains narrow and capability increases, more force passes through the same distortion. When more force passes through the same distortion, the outputs become larger, faster, and more consequential. When those outputs are embedded into systems, the distortions become infrastructural. When distortions become infrastructural, instability scales beyond the individual into civilization. And when civilization scale instability is fed by exponential capability without proportional widening of awareness, the entire system begins to approach thresholds it cannot skillfully navigate. This is why the chapter must be named as it is, Intelligence Without Awareness. Not because awareness is optional seasoning added to otherwise complete power, because without awareness, intelligence becomes amplifying machinery for whatever distortion the system has not yet learned to see. Now the system scales. Intelligence increases. More data, more tools, more capability, but perception remains narrow. And so more power flows through the same limitation. This creates acceleration without clarity, expansion without balance, systems that amplify their own instability. Not because of evil, because of misalignment between capability and awareness. And until that misalignment is addressed at the level of the living interface itself, the future will continue to inherit the brilliance of human intelligence without the widening of perception required to keep that brilliance from consuming the very worlds it builds. Chapter 9, The Hunger and the Loop. Humans are driven. They want. They reach. They move toward what calls them, what promises relief, what promises expansion, what promises power, what promises belonging, what promises survival, what promises meaning, what promises satisfaction, what promises the easing of discomfort, what promises the increase of self, tribe, system, structure, influence, or continuity. This drive is not an error. It is not a defect inserted into the human condition by some alien force. It is not proof of corruption in itself. It is part of motion. It is part of becoming. It is part of the living tendency of a system to seek, to act, to extend itself into the field, to reach for what appears to support its continuation, its enlargement, its fulfillment, or its stabilization. This is not wrong. It must be said cleanly, because so much confusion enters when the drive of the human system is condemned too early. Hunger is not the problem simply because it is hunger. Want is not the problem simply because it exists. Pursuit is not the problem simply because movement occurs. Expansion is not the problem simply because life does not remain inert. A human being without drive would not build, would not seek, would not create, would not discover, would not bond, would not protect, would not risk, would not imagine, would not survive. The drive to move towards something is not merely tolerated by life. It is part of life's unfolding through localized systems. And yet the same force that creates can also consume. The same hunger that builds can devour. The same drive that expands can destabilize. The same pursuit that makes civilization possible can hollow civilization out from within. Not because drive is evil, because drive without sufficient awareness becomes blind force. This is where the loop begins to reveal itself. When drive meets intelligence without awareness, the system does not become fulfilled. It becomes capable of pursuing more without necessarily seeing more. The wanting mechanism gains reach. The seeking mechanism gains leverage. The expanding mechanism gains tools. The organism, the institution, the civilization, the network, the economy, the technological apparatus, all of it becomes more able to act upon desire, more able to optimize acquisition, more able to intensify extraction, more able to scale pursuit. Yet if awareness has not widened enough to illuminate the deeper field of relation in which the drive is operating, then the system's appetite extends farther than its wisdom. It can take more than it can understand. It can move faster than it can regulate. It can extend itself beyond the range of its own clear seeing. Then the system consumes. It consumes resources. It consumes environments. It consumes attention. It consumes relation. It consumes coherence. It consumes future stability for present momentum. It consumes the substrate that allows its own continuation. And eventually, if the loop persists long enough, it consumes itself. Not intentionally, mechanically. This is one of the clearest and most important distinctions in the entire architecture of systems. The destruction does not always begin as malice. The collapse does not require a villain in the simplified moral sense. The loop does not depend on conscious hatred of life. A system can consume itself through ordinary function when that function is severed from sufficient awareness. The drive operates. The intelligence amplifies the drive. The awareness fails to widen in proportion. The system cannot feel the larger field. It cannot register the hidden thresholds. It cannot regulate what it cannot truly perceive. Therefore it continues. This is the mechanics of blind expansion. A thing reaches because reaching has worked before. It takes because taking generated gain before. It optimizes because optimization increased local power before. It repeats because repetition stabilized advantage before. It grows because growth felt like success before. And each of these movements can make perfect sense within the narrow field available to the system. Locally, the move appears rational. Immediately, the action appears effective. Short term, the result may even look triumphant. But the wider field is not being adequately registered. The unseen costs remain outside the active aperture. The deferred consequences remain dim. The relational losses remain diffused. The subtle degradations remain below the threshold of conscious salience. So the system continues drawing from what it cannot yet feel itself diminishing. What is not seen cannot be regulated. This is the heart of the chapter. Regulation is not first a matter of law, morality, or command. Those may come later. The root of regulation is registration. A system must be able to perceive enough of the relevant field to respond proportionally to it. It must be able to sense consequence before consequence becomes catastrophic. It must be able to feel interdependence before interdependence collapses into crisis. It must be able to register the relation between extraction and renewal, between action and delayed effect, between local gain and systemic strain, between short-term satisfaction and long-term instability. If these relations remain outside the active field of awareness, then the system cannot truly self-regulate, no matter how intelligent it becomes in other domains. This is why hunger alone does not doom a system. Unseen hunger does. Unregulated hunger does. Amplified hunger operating beyond the range of widened awareness does. A driven being with increasing capability but insufficient perception of the larger field becomes dangerous not because desire itself is inherently corrupt, but because desire gains means before it gains proportion. It gains power before it gains depth. It gains force before it gains fidelity to the whole. It can then act at scales that exceed its own understanding, drawing life toward patterns of accumulation, depletion, stimulation, domination, and feedback intensification that appear productive until the hidden fractures begin surfacing everywhere at once. This is visible in the human organism. A person may chase stimulation, success, validation, productivity, pleasure, control, influence, certainty, and endlessly increasing output. None of these desires are inherently evil in themselves. Each has understandable roots in life, adaptation, and embodiment. But if the person cannot see the broader mechanics of what those pursuits are doing to their nervous system, their relationships, their perception, their symbolic world, their sense of self, and their underlying coherence, then the same drive that once gave them strength becomes the engine of depletion. They consume their reserves. They consume their time. They consume their attention. They consume the quiet space in which recognition might have occurred. They consume their interior balance in the pursuit of what the narrow frame has defined as gain. This is visible in civilizations. A culture may pursue growth, production, efficiency, expansion, innovation, control over nature, technological increase, financial accumulation, military power, and endless development. Again, none of these impulses emerge from nowhere. They are expressions of drive moving through collective structures. But if the civilization cannot perceive the living systems it is embedded within, if it cannot feel the regenerative thresholds of the planet, if it cannot register the long-range consequences of extraction, if it cannot perceive that endless acceleration can hollow out the relational, ecological, and perceptual ground required for stable life, then the same brilliance that built its reach becomes the machinery of its destabilization. This is visible in institutions. An institution may seek survival, market share, dominance, efficiency, prestige, or expansion of influence. It becomes intelligent in how to optimize for those goals. It develops systems, metrics, technologies, incentives, hierarchies, and tactics to secure them. Yet if the institution cannot perceive the wider relational and human field it is shaping, it begins to consume trust, coherence, meaning, attentional health, ecological substrate, cultural integrity, and even the interior vitality of those who participate in it. It may call this success while quietly eroding the conditions that made its own emergence possible. This is visible in technological systems. A technology may be built to solve, extend, automate, enhance, accelerate, connect, or optimize. But if the systems deploying it cannot see enough of the field in which it intervenes, then the technology becomes a multiplier of existing hunger. It does not merely satisfy needs. It intensifies loops. It feeds attention into monetized extraction. It feeds desire into endless stimulation. It feeds insecurity into symbolic competition. It feeds power into systems already too narrow to wield it wisely. Then the technology is not acting from evil. It is acting as capability in service of a drive whose awareness has not widened enough to regulate its use. The hunger itself is not the enemy. The blindness around the hunger is the danger. This is a crucial refinement because it prevents the conversation from collapsing into false asceticism or denial of life. The answer is not to annihilate desire. The answer is not to shame motion, longing, appetite, curiosity, ambition, or expansion. Those are vital forces. The answer is to illuminate them. To bring them into a wider field. To let awareness deepen enough that drive is no longer operating as blind compulsion inside a narrow perceptual corridor. The issue is not that humans want. The issue is that what humans want is often pursued through symbolic structures and inherited agreements that do not reveal the full field of consequence. Thus hunger becomes loop when it loses relation. A loop forms when the system pursues relief, reward, gain, or stimulation through repeated behaviors that reinforce the conditions generating the hunger in the first place. This is one of the darkest and most ordinary mechanics in human life. The system feels lack, instability, fragmentation, or internal dissonance. It reaches for something that appears to satisfy, numb, amplify, or stabilize. That action may temporarily relieve the pressure. But because the deeper mechanics remain unilluminated, the action often reproduces the very contraction that generated the dissatisfaction. Then the lack returns. The hunger intensifies. The system reaches again, often with more force. A self-reinforcing cycle forms. Each repetition appears to seek completion, yet each repetition regenerates incompletion because the field is still not being clearly seen. This is why consumption can never solve what contraction creates. The system imagines that more intake will resolve what insufficient awareness has failed to illuminate. More stimulation. More acquisition. More proof. More success. More leverage. More certainty. More expansion. Yet if the inner mechanics remain unseen, the additional power only scales the loop. The hunger grows more sophisticated in its methods but not freer in its operation. The person, the group, the institution, or the civilization begins mistaking intensified capacity for real resolution. Meanwhile the underlying distortion persists untouched. There is a reason this becomes self-consuming. A loop that cannot perceive its own source must feed on outputs. It cannot regulate from the root, so it compensates through continued intake, continued motion, continued extraction, continued scaling. But because the root remains dark, each cycle requires more energy to maintain. The returns weaken. The byproducts accumulate. The substrate degrades. The system becomes increasingly dependent on the very patterns that are destabilizing it. It starts needing what is harming it because it no longer remembers how to relate without the loop. This is true of individuals, empires, economies, addictions, attention systems, relational dysfunctions, and cultural paradigms alike. The tragedy is not merely that the loop harms, it is that it often feels normal while doing so. This is because human beings can habituate to astonishing levels of distortion if the distortion is ambient enough. They can call exhaustion ambition. They can call depletion productivity. They can call distraction connection. They can call overconsumption progress. They can call destabilization growth. They can call symbolic warfare discourse. They can call fragmentation freedom. They can call extraction necessity. The loop maintains itself not only through behavior but through the symbols that justify behavior. The system not only consumes. It narrates its consumption as reality. Then the loop becomes cultural. Then it becomes structural. Then it becomes inherited. Then each new participant is born into a world where the self-consuming pattern is no longer recognized as pattern. It is treated as inevitability. It is treated as just how things work. It is treated as the cost of being human, the price of civilization, the nature of economics, the logic of competition, the shape of adulthood, the law of success, the realism of the world. And in that moment, the loop gains another layer of protection, because what is named as inevitable is rarely questioned at the depth required to dissolve it. Yet even here, the mechanics remain simple. If awareness widens, the loop becomes visible. If the loop becomes visible, drive can begin to be re-related to rather than blindly obeyed. If drive is re-related to within a wider field, regulation becomes possible. If regulation becomes possible, hunger no longer has to collapse into compulsive consumption. It can become intelligent in a deeper sense. It can become generative. It can participate in life without devouring the conditions of life. This is the turning point. Not the eradication of desire, but the illumination of its field. Not the shaming of hunger, but the widening of awareness around it. Not the suppression of movement, but the return of relation to movement. Once that occurs, drive can still seek, still build, still expand, still create, still move outward. But it no longer does so as blind machinery. It begins to feel the larger field. It begins to sense reciprocity. It begins to detect thresholds. It begins to register when expansion is generative and when it is extractive. It begins to know the difference between nourishment and compulsion, between growth and inflation, between creation and consumption, between healthy reach and self-eroding excess. Then hunger is no longer loop by default. It becomes energy in relation. It becomes motion in coherence. It becomes pursuit without automatic self-destruction. Humans are driven. They want, they pursue, they expand. This is not wrong. But when drive meets intelligence without awareness, the system consumes resources, environments, itself, not intentionally, mechanically, because what is not seen cannot be regulated. And until the field around hunger widens, the loop will continue mistaking its own repetition for necessity, even as it feeds upon the worlds that sustain it. Chapter 10, Truth, the stable within the flow. Truth is not narrative. Narrative is what the human system builds around contact. Narrative is what mind constructs once distinctions have been drawn, symbols stabilized, meanings woven, memories arranged, identities formed, and events threaded into a sequence that can be spoken, transmitted, defended, and inhabited. Narrative has use. It organizes. It contextualizes. It carries worlds. It allows continuity across time. It gives structure to experience. But narrative is not truth itself. Narrative is a rendering. It is an arrangement of symbol around reality. It can reveal. It can distort. It can clarify. It can conceal. It can orient the system toward coherence or imprison it inside inherited agreement. But whatever narrative may do, it remains downstream. It remains a formed response to what is more primary than it. Truth is not belief. Belief is allegiance. Belief is trust placed into a frame, a model, a symbol, a structure, a conclusion, a doctrine, a felt certainty, an explanation, or a world rendering. Belief can approximate truth. Belief can also separate the system from truth entirely. Belief can be useful, stabilizing, dangerous, luminous, delusional, provisional, or rigid. But belief is not truth itself. Truth does not become more true because it is believed. Truth does not become false because it is rejected. Truth does not depend for its existence upon consensus, loyalty, repetition, devotion, or social reinforcement. Belief belongs to the perceiving and meaning-making system. Truth belongs to a deeper order than preference, agreement, or interpretation. Truth is what remains consistent regardless of perception. This must be understood with precision. It does not mean perception is irrelevant. Perception still determines what becomes available to awareness within a given embodied field. Perception still governs how the real is contacted, distinguished, symbolized, and lived. But truth is not created by that perceptual process. Truth may be rendered differently, named differently, partitioned differently, obscured differently, or recognized differently depending on the lens through which it is approached. Yet underneath the variance of rendering, something remains. Some relation holds. Some pattern persists. Some structure continues being what it is whether or not the observer has clearly registered it. That persistence is the beginning of what is meant here by truth. This is why truth is not static, but stable. Static implies frozen lifelessness, a dead thing unmoving in a universe of movement. Static implies rigidity, immobility, cessation, the absence of process. But reality is not static. Reality is motion. It is interaction, exchange, transformation, relation, emergence, decay, renewal, propagation, modulation, oscillation, rhythm, continuity, and change. Nothing living is truly static. Even what appears still is often sustained by immense hidden movement. Even what looks fixed is being maintained through process. So if truth is sought as something merely static, it will be misunderstood from the start. The deeper insight is that truth is stable within motion. It is the pattern that holds while the field moves. It is the relation that remains intelligible while forms change. It is the consistency that can be found across transformation. It is the order that does not vanish simply because the system passes through different states. It is the reliable structure that persists even though its expressions may be dynamic, layered, and alive. Truth does not need to be frozen in order to be real. It only needs to remain coherent through motion. It only needs to keep holding. It only needs to avoid contradiction across the living movement in which it is expressed. Reality is motion. Truth is the pattern that holds within that motion. This is why the language of stability is more accurate than the language of stasis. A living body is not static, yet it exhibits stable patterns that make its continued existence possible. An ecosystem is not static, yet it may embody stable relations that allow the whole to sustain itself across seasons, births, deaths, fluctuations, and disturbances. A solar system is not static, yet there are stable mechanics by which its motion coheres. The ocean is not static, yet there are stable laws and relations governing its behavior. Language itself is not static, culture is not static, civilizations are not static, the psyche is not static, life is not static. Yet truth can still be present wherever a relation remains consistently what it is across the movement. This is why the sun shines is such a clean example. The sun shines not as a rigid slogan but as an ongoing process. It is not a dead fact pinned like an insect to a board of abstraction. It is a living stability. It is a continuous expression of underlying mechanics that do not contradict themselves merely because the process is dynamic. The sun is active. It is moving. It is radiating. It is engaged in a sustained unfolding. Yet within that unfolding, there is coherence. There is continuity. There is a pattern holding. The truth is not that the sun is frozen. The truth is that the process remains itself in a reliable way. The truth lies not in immobility, but in consistency through motion. This distinction matters profoundly because much confusion about truth arises from mistaking stable pattern for rigid object. A rigid thing often breaks. A stable pattern often sustains. A frozen model may collapse under the living complexity of reality. A true relation continues holding within that complexity. This is why truth, properly approached, often has a kind of flexibility without becoming arbitrary. Not flexibility in the sense of changing into whatever one wishes. Not malleability in the sense of subjective invention. But flexibility in the sense that what is true can remain itself across changing conditions because it is rooted in deeper coherence than surface variation. It does not need every outer form to remain identical in order for the inner relation to hold. The pattern sustains while the expressions move. This is also why truth can be self-sustaining in a precise sense. Not because truth is some mystical substance floating free of all context, but because what is true does not require distortion, force, or artificial defense in order to remain what it is. It does not need constant narrative reinforcement to keep existing. It does not need symbolic inflation to stay alive. It does not need emotional manipulation to survive scrutiny. It does not need coercive repetition to remain real. It may need recognition to become consciously known within a given system, but it does not need recognition in order to be what it is. The relation holds whether or not the observer sees it clearly. This is the non-extractive quality of truth. It does not feed on belief to maintain itself. It remains. Distortion is different. Distortion must be defended. Distortion depends on concealment, misdirection, compression, exaggeration, omission, premature closure, or selective framing in order to preserve itself. Distortion may appear stable for a time, but it is parasitic on incomplete seeing. It relies upon the field not being fully perceived. It requires certain variables to stay excluded, certain contradictions to remain unintegrated, certain assumptions to stay invisible, certain questions to remain unasked, certain layers to remain unread. Distortion may become culturally normalized, institutionally embedded, emotionally reinforced, or technologically amplified, but beneath all of that it remains unstable because it does not fully align with the deeper coherence of what is. Thus it needs maintenance. It needs protection. It needs the continuation of limited perception. This is why truth does not require defense. Truth may be ignored, denied, obscured, resisted, or buried beneath vast symbolic architectures, yet it does not become internally contradictory because of this. It does not need rhetoric to keep itself from falling apart. It may require articulation for human communication. It may require skill to be expressed clearly. It may require courage to be spoken in environments structured against it. But none of that is the same as needing defense to remain true. Defense in the deeper sense is required when the thing itself cannot survive exposure. Truth survives exposure. Distortion fears it. This is why scrutiny matters. Not because scrutiny creates truth, but because scrutiny reveals where distortion begins to fail. When a pattern is subjected to careful observation, logical testing, coherence testing, relational examination, and lived contact across contexts, the false begins to crack where it contradicts itself. Distortion can hold for astonishing lengths of time if the field remains sufficiently narrow. But when perception widens, when more layers are allowed in, when more variables are registered, when hidden contradictions are illuminated, what is distorted begins to strain under the weight of fuller contact. It must then either collapse, mutate, or retreat into more defensive strategies. Truth, by contrast, may become more deeply understood through scrutiny. It may reveal subtleties previously unseen. It may become more nuanced, more alive, more integrated, more exact. But its coherence deepens rather than disintegrates. This is why truth is intimately linked with coherence. Coherence is not style. It is not rhetorical elegance. It is not the mere appearance of order. Coherence is the non-contradictory holding together of relation. A true pattern coheres because it reflects something structurally consistent within reality. A distorted pattern can imitate coherence superficially, but under fuller examination its internal tensions emerge. Something begins not to fit. Something must be excluded to preserve the illusion. Something has to be hidden or overemphasized or severed from its larger context to make the rendering appear stable. That is why distortion ultimately consumes energy. It must keep managing what the true does not need to manage. Truth is therefore not only what remains consistent regardless of perception. It is also what remains internally non-contradictory as wider perception comes online. This is a crucial refinement because it protects against simplification. Some patterns appear consistent only because the observer is still too narrow to see the contradiction. Some narratives feel coherent only because hidden assumptions have not yet been exposed. Some systems look stable only because delayed consequences have not yet arrived. So the testing of truth is not merely the noticing of immediate persistence. It is the widening of the field and the observation of whether the pattern still holds. If it does, then one approaches something increasingly foundational. If it does not, then distortion was masquerading as truth through limited view. This also clarifies why truth is often discovered not through accumulation alone, but through reduction of distortion. A human being may spend years collecting information, theories, methods, and symbols while remaining far from the real. Then, in a quieter moment of recognition, one distortion falls away, one false assumption collapses, one symbolic freeze loosens, one closure opens, and suddenly the person is closer to truth not because more was added, but because something false was removed. This is consistent with the whole architecture already traced in this text. The lens widens. More of reality becomes available. Distortion loses force. The stable pattern can now be seen more directly. Truth was not created in that moment. It was less obscured. Truth is foundational because it is what makes coherent experience possible. This is what gives truth its deeper gravity. Truth is not merely a set of propositions floating above life. It is not just a collection of correct statements. It is the stable architecture of relation that allows reality to hold together in intelligible form at all. It is the reason processes do not become arbitrary chaos. It is the reason coherent systems can exist. It is the reason cause and consequence can be traced, why stable mechanics can be discovered, why patterns can be recognized, why science can function, why perception can never align more deeply with what is actually there, why reality does not dissolve into total contradiction at every level. Truth is not simply the right answer. It is the enduring coherence within existence itself. This is why truth can feel so unmistakable when directly recognized. Not because every feeling of certainty is true. Many certainties are distortions. But genuine recognition often carries a specific signature, not the aggressive closure of ideology, but the settling force of coherence. Not the brittleness of belief defending itself, but the quiet strength of something that does not need embellishment to remain intact. Not the intoxication of dramatic revelation, but the clean alignment of something that simply holds. It often feels obvious afterward, not because it was simplistic, but because the distortion that hid it had consumed so much unnecessary energy. Once the distortion falls away, the stable pattern reveals how deeply it had already been there. This does not mean truth is always immediately easy to articulate. Language may lag behind recognition. Symbol may strain to carry the depth of contact. Models may still need refinement. Concepts may still be incomplete. Interpretation may still carry residue from the prior lens. Yet the contact with truth has a different order of stability than the symbolic structures built around it. One can feel the difference. One can test the difference. One can watch what collapses and what remains. This is why narrative and belief must remain secondary. They may serve truth or obscure it, but they are not its source. Truth is the stable within the flow. This phrase must be held carefully because it rescues truth from two major distortions at once. It rescues truth from rigid dogmatism, which mistakes truth for static dead certainty. And it rescues truth from relativistic dissolution, which mistakes the dynamism of reality for the absence of stable pattern. Truth is neither frozen dogma nor arbitrary fluidity. It is stable relation in living motion. It is what holds while life moves. It is what coheres while forms change. It is what remains non-contradictory while conditions vary. It is what does not need force to stay itself. The sun shines, not as a frozen fact, but as a continuous process that does not contradict itself. This sentence contains far more than astronomy. It contains the architecture of how truth should be approached. Not as dead statement, but as living coherence. Not as abstract proclamation, but as stable process. Not as static object, but as ongoing reality that holds its pattern through motion. And because it holds, it can be trusted more deeply than mere narrative. Not because the human being made it trustworthy, but because the relation itself remains. Truth does not require defense. Distortion does. And from this alone, a great deal can be seen. What screams for protection, manipulates perception, demands blind allegiance, punishes scrutiny, relies upon confusion, and collapses when more of reality is allowed into the field is revealing its own instability. What remains, what coheres, what deepens under wider contact, what becomes clearer rather than more brittle under examination, what does not need coercion to stay itself, this moves closer to truth. Truth is not narrative. Truth is not belief. Truth is what remains consistent regardless of perception. Not static, but stable. Reality is motion. Truth is the pattern that holds within that motion. And once this is genuinely understood, the search for truth stops being a hunt for rigid conclusions and becomes instead a deepening intimacy with what remains coherently itself no matter how much of the field is allowed to enter. Chapter 11. Distortion and collapse. Distortion can persist. This must be seen clearly at the beginning so that the mind does not confuse duration with truth, survival with coherence, repetition with reality, or endurance with alignment. Distortion can persist for astonishing lengths of time. It can persist in a person. It can persist in a family. It can persist in an institution. It can persist in a civilization. It can persist in language, ideology, economy, religion, politics, medicine, education, identity, trauma, ambition, technology, and every other domain where symbol has hardened into structure and structure has ceased to be questioned at the root. Distortion is not weak simply because it is false in a deeper sense. Often it appears powerful precisely because it has learned how to sustain itself within a narrowed field. Yet persistence is not the same as true sustainability. A thing may continue for a long time while quietly eroding the very conditions that allow its continuation. A thing may dominate a field while secretly consuming its own substrate. A thing may appear stable because the variables that would expose its contradiction have not yet fully entered the field of awareness. A thing may retain institutional, cultural, emotional, or symbolic force while already carrying within itself the seeds of its own unraveling. This is why distortion must be distinguished from mere failure. Distortion does not always fail immediately. It often survives through management. It survives through concealment. It survives through compression. It survives through the strategic narrowing of the field. It survives by making sure that what would expose it cannot easily become visible. But it cannot sustain indefinitely. This is not a moral promise. It is not cosmic revenge. It is not a sentimental assurance that everything misaligned will instantly be corrected by some external force. It is a mechanical statement. Distortion cannot sustain indefinitely because distortion is internally costly. It requires active maintenance. It requires selective blindness. It requires the continuation of exclusion. It requires the regulation of perception away from what would reveal its fracture. It requires the suppression, dismissal, deferral, or symbolic misframing of contradiction. And all of that consumes energy. All of that creates strain. All of that generates instability beneath apparent order. This is why distortion requires reinforcement. A truth does not need to be constantly manufactured into existence. A stable pattern does not need symbolic inflation to remain what it is. Distortion does. Distortion must be repeated. It must be reaffirmed. It must be normalized. It must be taught as obvious. It must be stabilized through symbol, reward, fear, habit, identity, institutional embedding, inherited agreement, and ongoing behavioral participation. The reason distortion needs reinforcement is because it is not fully self-coherent. Left entirely exposed to the full field, it begins to weaken. Therefore it must be fed. It must be socially and psychologically nourished through the continued narrowing of what counts as real, thinkable, sayable, or perceivable. This reinforcement may appear in crude forms or subtle ones. It may appear as propaganda, as dogma, as punishment for deviation, as ritual repetition, as inherited saying, as social norm, as strategic commission, as unspoken taboo, as emotional conditioning, as professional consensus, as bureaucratic procedure, as algorithmic curation, as incentive structure, as identity protection, as common sense. It does not matter what domain it appears in. The pattern remains the same. Distortion is sustained through repetition because repetition can simulate inevitability. What is said often enough, rewarded often enough, feared deeply enough, and questioned rarely enough begins to feel like reality itself. This is also why distortion requires protection. A distorted structure cannot remain indifferent to exposure. It may tolerate shallow questioning. It may even absorb certain forms of opposition and turn them into further reinforcement. But at depth, distortion is vulnerable. Not vulnerable because it is emotionally fragile in the human sense, but because its coherence is incomplete. It cannot withstand unrestricted contact with the full field indefinitely. Thus it must protect itself from wider perception. It must guard the aperture. It must control the conditions of visibility. It must determine which distinctions become thinkable and which remain off limits. It must preserve the environment in which its partial rendering can continue to function as if it were whole. Protection takes many forms. Sometimes it is explicit. Sometimes it is structural. Sometimes it is so ambient that the participants do not know they are protecting anything at all. They simply feel discomfort when the deeper contradiction approaches. They simply feel threat when a wider field begins to open. They simply defend what feels familiar, because familiarity has fused with reality in their system. The protection then becomes automatic. The distorted pattern is defended not always because people consciously love falsehood, but because the pattern has colonized their sense of what existence is. To threaten the distortion feels, to such a system, like threatening reality itself. This is why distortion also requires avoidance of scrutiny. Scrutiny is dangerous to distortion because scrutiny widens the field. Scrutiny introduces variables. Scrutiny compares layers. Scrutiny tests consistency. Scrutiny notices gaps between claim and operation, between narrative and consequence, between local success and global instability, between symbol and underlying relation. Scrutiny invites more reality into the frame than the distortion can comfortably metabolize. It permits contradiction to approach. It allows delayed effects to become visible. It notices what has been omitted. It examines the cost of the structure, not merely its immediate utility. For this reason, distortion rarely welcomes unrestricted scrutiny at the depth that matters most. It may welcome selective analysis. It may encourage metrics that reinforce its own conclusions. It may celebrate technical evaluation within a narrow frame while resisting the broader examination that would expose the foundational misalignment. It may become extremely sophisticated in defending itself through partial truths, localized efficiencies, symbolic substitution, emotional urgency, moral inversion, or reclassification of the critique itself. But the need remains the same. Distortion must avoid full scrutiny because full scrutiny eventually introduces the conditions in which contradiction can no longer remain hidden. And eventually, contradiction emerges. This is inevitable not because reality is sentimental, but because distortion is internally divided against the larger field it inhabits. The contradiction may emerge slowly or suddenly. It may appear first as discomfort, dissonance, inconsistency, exhaustion, fragility, side effects, hidden costs, breakdown of trust, diminished returns, ecological strain, psychological fragmentation, bureaucratic absurdity, narrative incoherence, infrastructural failure, relational toxicity, or spiritual deadness. It may appear first as something small, almost ignorable. It may be rationalized. It may be deferred. It may be misnamed. It may be absorbed into a temporary patch. But if the distortion remains operative, the contradiction does not vanish. It accumulates. This accumulation matters because contradiction is not only logical. It is experiential, structural, energetic, and systemic. A person living in distortion may say one thing and live another until the split becomes unbearable. An institution may claim one set of values while incentivizing another until the discrepancy corrodes its own integrity. A civilization may celebrate endless growth while undermining the substrate of growth until the contradiction becomes materially undeniable. A technological system may optimize for engagement while destroying the attentional conditions necessary for meaningful human engagement. A culture may preach freedom while organizing itself through dependency and compulsion. In every case, contradiction is the point where the structure reveals that its claims and its operations cannot be fully reconciled. This is why what contradicts itself collapses. Collapse does not always mean immediate annihilation. It does not always look dramatic at first. Sometimes collapse begins as loss of coherence. Sometimes it appears as increasing maintenance burden. Sometimes it appears as the need for ever more reinforcement to produce less and less stability. Sometimes it appears as disintegration of trust, meaning, vitality, resilience, flexibility, or regenerative capacity. Sometimes collapse is delayed because the system still has reserves to burn. Sometimes collapse is displaced onto others or hidden behind temporary gains. Sometimes collapse is masked by spectacle, speed, symbolic control, or externalized cost. But beneath all appearances, the mechanical truth remains: a structure built on contradiction cannot maintain integrity forever. The contradiction eventually works through the system until the pattern breaks, mutates, fragments, or is forced into reorganization. Not morally, mechanically. This distinction protects the entire framework from distortion. Collapse is not punishment in the childish sense. It is not proof that the universe operates by simple reward and retribution. It is not a theater of cosmic virtue signaling. A contradiction collapses because it cannot indefinitely maintain non-coherent relation within a larger coherent field. It may persist. It may dominate. It may seduce. It may intimidate. It may become normal. It may even shape entire centuries. But if its operations are fundamentally misaligned with the deeper mechanics of reality, then the cost of holding that misalignment must continue rising. The strain compounds. The exclusions must intensify. The defenses must thicken. The reinforcements must multiply. Eventually the maintenance load itself becomes part of the contradiction. The structure spends more and more of its energy preserving what cannot truly sustain itself. This is one of the clearest signatures of distortion, increasing effort for decreasing coherence. The person trapped in distortion often feels this long before they can name it. Their world becomes heavier. More managing is required. More narrative defense is required. More emotional effort is required. More symbolic repetition is required. More avoidance is required. More stimulation is required. More force is required to hold together what no longer truly holds. The same is true of systems. The institution requires ever more bureaucracy to preserve trust it no longer naturally generates. The economy requires ever more extraction to sustain returns its design has already undermined. The social order requires ever more distraction to prevent participants from seeing the contradiction. The technological environment requires ever more intervention to solve problems it created through unregulated scaling. These are not separate anomalies. They are symptoms of collapse already underway in its less visible phases. Distortion collapses because it cannot generate from its own contradiction indefinitely. This is where the distinction between extractive and generative becomes important again. A generative system aligns more closely with the patterns that sustain the conditions of its own continuation. It may still adapt, it may still struggle, it may still undergo correction, but its movements tend toward reciprocal coherence. Distortion, by contrast, extracts from realities it does not properly perceive. It takes from fields it does not adequately honor. It narrows what should remain relational. It freezes what should remain dynamic. It consumes what it cannot regenerate because it cannot fully see the depth of what it is using. This makes it powerful in the short term and unstable in the long term. Its apparent strength is often borrowed against a future it is simultaneously weakening. This is why collapse is often experienced first as revelation. The contradiction becomes visible. The thing no longer works the same way once seen. Its symbolic glamour weakens. Its authority softens. The observer notices the hidden cost, the split, the omission, the self-cancelling operation, the way the structure depends on the very blindness it claims to resolve. Once seen clearly enough, the distortion cannot return to total invisibility. Its spell breaks. The collapse may still unfold gradually in practice, but at the level of authority, something has already fallen. What once looked self-evident now looks managed. What once looked final now looks fragile. What once looked like truth now looks like a construction requiring concealment to survive. This is why recognition matters so much in the process of collapse. Recognition does not create the contradiction. It reveals it. It does not punish the distortion. It removes the invisibility that allowed the distortion to function as reality. It does not impose collapse from outside. It withdraws unconscious reinforcement from a structure that needed it. Then the pattern begins to fail more visibly because the conditions that stabilized it have weakened. This is true in the psyche, in relationships, in organizations, in societies, and in larger civilizational arrangements. What was maintained by invisible agreement begins to fall apart once agreement is no longer being unconsciously supplied at the same depth. Yet collapse itself is not the end of the story. The ending of distortion is also the reopening of possibility. Once contradiction is exposed and false stability fails, the field is no longer locked in the same way. A wider registration becomes possible. More reality can enter. More coherent structures can emerge. This does not mean collapse is pleasant. It can be painful, disorienting, destabilizing, costly, and deeply disruptive. But its deeper significance is not destruction for its own sake. It is the failure of what could not continue without concealment. It is the release of energy from maintaining the false. It is the reopening of the field to what may actually hold. This is why collapse must be understood cleanly. If it is moralized too quickly, the mechanical lesson is missed. If it is sentimentalized, the rigor is lost. If it is feared without being understood, the system clings harder to the distortion. If it is welcomed carelessly, one fails to honor the real cost borne by living beings caught inside misaligned structures. The right relation is clarity. Distortion can persist. It can dominate fields. It can organize worlds. It can survive through reinforcement, protection, and avoidance of scrutiny. But because it is misaligned at depth, contradiction eventually emerges. And what contradicts itself collapses, not because someone condemns it, but because it cannot indefinitely remain divided against the larger coherence in which it is suspended. This chapter therefore reveals one of the sternest mercies in reality. Falsehood can be stabilized, but not infinitely. Partial seeing can dominate, but not without cost. Distortion can inherit power, but not finality. That which must constantly defend itself against fuller contact is already telling the truth about its own instability. And that which collapses under widened perception was never sustained by truth to begin with. Distortion can persist, but it cannot sustain indefinitely, because distortion requires reinforcement, protection, avoidance of scrutiny. And eventually contradiction emerges. And what contradicts itself collapses, not morally, mechanically. And in that mechanical unraveling, the field is offered again to recognition, to wider seeing, and to the possibility of structures that do not need concealment in order to live. Chapter 12, The Collective as Nodes. There is no singular collective mind in the simplistic sense. There is no giant centralized thinker hovering above humanity, issuing commands into every individual system as though all human life were merely the puppeteering of one singular conscious entity. That model is too crude. It collapses living complexity into an abstraction that hides the actual mechanics. What exists is more precise, more subtle, and in many ways more powerful. There are nodes. There are localized systems of awareness and perception. There are individual human beings, each receiving, filtering, distinguishing, symbolizing, acting, reinforcing, and participating from within their own field of contact. Each one is a point of experience. Each one is a site of interpretation. Each one is a living interface through which reality is rendered and then fed back into the larger web of the world. This is the beginning of the collective in actual mechanics. Not one mind ruling all minds. Many nodes generating pattern worlds together. Each human perceives. Each human acts. Each human reinforces. This sequence is simple, but it is not shallow. It contains the seed of nearly everything that becomes social reality. A node receives the world through its lens. That lens determines what becomes available to awareness. What becomes available to awareness is shaped into distinctions. Distinctions become symbols. Symbols become meanings. Meanings inform action. Action enters relationship, structure, environment, and system. The outputs of one node meet the outputs of countless others. Repetition begins. Reinforcement begins. Similar distinctions stabilize. Similar symbols circulate. Similar meanings accumulate. Similar actions compound. And from this layering of localized operations, patterns emerge that no single node alone authored in full, but that all participating nodes, to varying degrees, help sustain. This is what is called the world. The world, in this sense, is not merely the physical planet or the raw substrate of material existence. The world, as humans live it, is the patterned field produced by countless nodes operating through shared or overlapping perceptual structures. It is the social rendering of reality. It is the stabilized architecture of agreements, structures, habits, symbols, institutions, customs, economies, moralities, laws, categories, myths, defaults, and expectations generated through repeated participation. It is not fantasy, and it is not arbitrary. It has force because it is enacted. It has consequence because it is reproduced. It has momentum because it is not held in a single place. It lives across nodes. It exists in repetition. It endures through distributed reinforcement. This is why the collective must be understood as emergent. It is not imposed in the total sense, though power absolutely exists, hierarchy exists, coercion exists, unequal influence exists, and some nodes or structures can dramatically shape the conditions under which others operate. None of that is denied here. But even power itself functions through nodes, through systems of perception, through agreements, through inherited structures that continue because enough participants keep perceiving, acting, and reinforcing in ways that stabilize them. What appears monolithic is often emergent. What appears top-down is often sustained by bottom-up participation. What appears like a singular civilization-wide reality is actually the accumulated output of millions upon millions of localized systems operating within shared symbolic and perceptual conditions. This is why the phrase accumulated behavior from shared perception is so exact. The collective is not merely shared opinion. It is not merely cultural narrative. It is not merely population statistics. It is the accumulated result of how nodes see and therefore how they move. Shared perception does not mean every person thinks identically. It means enough overlap exists in the way reality is rendered that behavior begins to converge into larger patterns. Enough nodes inherit similar distinctions. Enough nodes stabilize similar symbols. Enough nodes accept similar limitations. Enough nodes reinforce similar incentives. Enough nodes act from similar assumptions. Over time, these recurring operations no longer look like countless local acts. They look like society, history, the economy, human nature, the culture, the times, or simply the way the world is. But what is being called the way the world is often the sedimented output of repeated node behavior. This is one of the deepest thresholds of understanding in the entire architecture being traced here, because it dissolves both naive individualism and naive collectivism at once. The individual is not an isolated island acting in a vacuum. Nor is the collective a mystical abstraction that entirely overrides local agency. The real field is reciprocal. The node is shaped by the world it enters. The world it enters is itself the accumulated patterning of prior nodes. The node then perceives through that inherited world, acts within it, and either reinforces or destabilizes its patterns through participation. Then the resulting outputs help shape the world inherited by other nodes. Thus the collective is neither wholly external nor wholly internal. It is emergent relation. It is distributed stabilization. It is a field of patterned reciprocity. This is why unconscious agreement is such a powerful force. Not because everyone consciously signs a contract. Not because humanity secretly gathers on some hidden plane and chooses its reality in literal symbolic meetings. But because each node, operating through inherited perception, unconsciously contributes to what becomes stabilized. The agreement is operational. It is embedded in the seeing, the acting, the repetition, the adaptation, the resignation, the fear, the norms, the phrases, the inherited categories, the unquestioned assumptions, the accepted trade-offs, the reinforced structures. A node may consciously dislike the pattern while still participating in the reinforcement of it because its perceptual field has not yet widened enough to generate a materially different relation. Thus one can consciously say no while operationally contributing yes, not as moral failure, but as the mechanics of participation within an unseen field. This is why collective patterns often feel so difficult to change. They are not held in one place. They are distributed. They are encoded into behavior, expectation, symbol, design, incentive, language, fear, habit, attention, identity, and survival strategy across vast numbers of nodes. To change such a pattern, one need not imagine some impossible task of overpowering a singular monster. One must understand emergence. One must see that the pattern lives because it is being reproduced across innumerable local interfaces. This means the pattern is powerful, but it also means it is not absolute. What emerges from nodes can change as nodes change, especially when shifts in perception begin altering the distinctions, symbols, and actions through which the pattern has been maintained. This is where the dignity of the node becomes clear. A node matters not because it is the whole by itself, but because emergence depends on local participation. Each human system is a site where perception can narrow or widen, where symbols can harden or loosen, where inherited agreements can remain invisible or become visible, where unconscious reinforcement can continue or be interrupted, where direct recognition can occur, where the loop can deepen or begin to break. The node is not omnipotent. It does not command the collective alone. Yet neither is it meaningless. It is one of the actual places where the collective exists. There is no collective without nodes. There is no world pattern without repeated local enactment. There is no society apart from the innumerable lived operations through which society is continuously reproduced. This also explains why local transformation can have broader consequence without needing to become grandiose. A single widened node does not instantly rewrite civilization. That would be distortion. But a widened node changes what that node perceives, what it can register, what symbols it accepts, what actions it takes, what structures it reinforces, what agreements it participates in, what language it circulates, what designs it supports, what worlds it helps build. It changes its outputs. Those outputs enter relation with other nodes. They alter patterns, even if subtly at first. Over time, enough such shifts can create emergent change. This is not fantasy. It is simply how distributed systems work. The macro is made of micro-recurrence. A civilization is not only policy and infrastructure. It is patterned node behavior stabilized over time. This is also why not all nodes have equal influence, yet all still matter. Some nodes sit inside larger leverage points. Some control resources, infrastructures, institutions, platforms, information systems, or weapons. Some shape symbolic fields for millions. Some organize incentives that guide the behavior of others. Some occupy positions through which their outputs ripple farther or faster. This is real, and it matters. Yet even such high leverage nodes remain nodes. They are still perceiving, acting, and reinforcing from within their own operating state. Their leverage magnifies consequence, but it does not exempt them from the mechanics. A narrow node with enormous capability can destabilize far more than a narrow node without such capability. A widened node with enormous capability can generate coherence at scales that many smaller nodes cannot. This is why the interaction between node state and leverage matters so profoundly in the shaping of the world. Still, no leverage point floats outside the distributed field altogether. Even large institutions require participating nodes to operate them. Even dominant narratives require recurring nodes to repeat them. Even laws require nodes to enforce, follow, resist, reinterpret, or navigate them. Even economic systems require nodes to buy, sell, labor, optimize, hoard, desire, fear, and consume within them. Even digital architectures require nodes to code, deploy, click, scroll, react, and reinforce. At every scale, the collective remains what emerges through participating systems, not something wholly separate from them. This means the world is neither wholly imposed nor wholly chosen in the simplistic sense. It is continuously generated. This sentence resolves much confusion. The world is not merely forced upon passive beings from nowhere. Nor is it a perfectly conscious collective choice made with equal freedom by every participant. It is generated through the interaction of inheritance, perception, symbolic structure, unequal leverage, localized agency, historical momentum, environmental conditions, and recurrent participation. It is living emergence. It is patterned continuation. It is the outcome of nodes moving in relation under already existing conditions, conditions that themselves were generated by earlier node activity. This recursive structure is what makes the collective seem so mysterious. Yet the mystery becomes legible once the mechanics are seen. A node perceives, a node acts, a node reinforces, a pattern stabilizes, a world appears. That world then shapes future nodes. Future nodes inherit the world as though it were simply reality. They perceive through its structures. They act from within its assumptions. They reinforce what they have not yet recognized as inherited. And the cycle continues. This is not a trap only. It is also the secret of transformation. Because if the collective were a singular fixed entity, change would be nearly unimaginable. But because it is emergent, because it is distributed, because it is generated across nodes, change is possible wherever local participation changes. Not easy. Not immediate. Not guaranteed. But structurally possible. The same mechanics that stabilize a fragmented world can stabilize a more coherent one if enough nodes begin operating from wider perception, different distinctions, different symbols, and different forms of relation. This is why language about humanity often obscures more than it reveals. Humanity is not an abstraction floating above human beings. Humanity is the distributed pattern of human nodes in relation. To speak of humanity changing while ignoring the mechanics of perception within actual people is to remain too vague. To speak only of individual transformation while ignoring the way patterns emerge collectively is to remain too narrow. The truth is the reciprocity. The node and the field are inseparable in operation. The local and the collective are not enemies. They are scales of the same generative process. This is also why one must resist both despair and inflation. Despair says the node is too small to matter because the collective is too large. Inflation says one node alone can force the whole to change through mere intensity of belief. Both are distortions. The clearer view is that nodes matter because the collective is made of nodes, yet no node is the whole by itself. This restores proportion. It restores coherence. It restores the seriousness of local transformation without collapsing into fantasy or self-erasure. It reveals why personal perception matters so much and why broader systemic analysis matters equally. The one becomes the many through recurrence. The many become the inherited world through stabilization. There is no singular collective mind. There are nodes. Each human perceives, acts, reinforces. And when enough nodes operate the same way, patterns emerge. This is what is called the world. Not imposed in total, but accumulated behavior from shared perception. To see this clearly is to stop treating the world as a monolith divorced from participation. It is to begin understanding the generative mechanics of civilization, culture, structure, and collective reality itself. It is to realize that what appears solid at the macro scale is often the compounded output of countless local operations repeated long enough to seem inevitable. And it is to recognize, perhaps for the first time with full seriousness, that widening perception within the node is not a private luxury. It is one of the actual places where worlds begin to change. Chapter 13, The Return of Seeing. Nothing new is required. This must be understood with full precision, because the ordinary human system has been trained to imagine transformation as acquisition. It imagines that if the world feels fragmented, more content is needed. If reality feels narrow, more information is needed. If meaning feels unstable, more systems are needed. If suffering persists, more methods are needed. If confusion reigns, more symbols are needed. If the field feels closed, then perhaps the answer must be hidden in some distant teaching, some secret body of knowledge, some future invention, some final language, some perfected doctrine, some superior structure not yet obtained. Yet this reflex, though understandable, often continues the very movement that obscured direct seeing in the first place. The system reaches outward for what it imagines is missing while overlooking the more primary fact that what is already here has not yet been clearly perceived. Nothing new is required, only seeing the lens. This is the return. Not the return to ignorance. Not the return to earlier conditioning. Not the return to inherited structure. Not the return to childish simplicity. Not the return to the first unconscious innocence that mistakes the world as given without ever questioning the filter through which it is being rendered. This return is more subtle and more exact. It is the return of seeing itself. It is the restoration of direct relationship with the fact that the world as lived is mediated, shaped, partitioned, named, stabilized, and believed through a lens that is usually mistaken for reality. To see that lens is not to add something to life. It is to remove the invisibility from what has always been operative. This is why the whole architecture traced through this text resolves here. The lens came before the world as the ordinary self knows it. Distinction emerged from the lens. Symbol stabilized distinction. Agreement hardened symbol into shared structure. Illusory limitation froze perception into apparent permanence. Recognition broke the filter just enough for something more primary to enter. Expansion widened the perceptual field. Awareness and perception revealed themselves as a living interface. Intelligence without awareness exposed the danger of scaling power through a narrow aperture. Hunger without widened seeing showed how a driven system consumes what it cannot regulate. Truth clarified itself as the stable pattern within the flow. Distortion revealed its dependence on reinforcement, protection, and avoidance of scrutiny. The collective disclosed itself as emergent from nodes. Every movement pointed back toward one thing: seeing the lens. Because once the lens is seen, the entire tyranny of unconscious mediation begins to weaken. This is not dramatic in the superficial sense. The world does not have to explode into spectacle. The sky does not have to split. The person does not have to become someone else overnight in order for the essential shift to occur. The return of seeing is often quieter than the mind expects, but its consequences are immense. The first thing that happens is that distinction becomes visible. This does not mean distinction disappears. It means the process of distinction can now be perceived as process. The observer no longer experiences categories as though they descended from eternity fully formed and self-explaining. They begin to see how distinctions were drawn, how salience was assigned, how symbols followed, how the world became partitioned through a particular mode of contact. This alone begins to dissolve enormous layers of unconscious fixation. When distinction becomes visible, symbol loosens. Again, the symbol does not vanish. Language is not abolished. Names are not made useless. Categories do not become irrelevant. But their enchantment softens. The symbol no longer holds the same absolute force because it is no longer mistaken for the thing itself. The person can still use words, but words no longer imprison the real so completely. The category can still function, but it no longer masquerades as essence with the same authority. The inherited label can still be recognized, but it is now seen as downstream rather than primary. This is one of the great restorations of freedom in the human system. The world becomes less dominated by its symbolic freeze because the observer has recognized symbol as symbol. Then limitations reveal themselves. This is a crucial movement, because many limitations were never actual revelations of reality's deepest mechanics. They were rendered closures. They were stabilized contractions. They were inherited perceptual compressions mistaken for final truths. Once the lens is seen, these limitations begin to show their construction. The phrase "that's just how it is" no longer lands as inevitability in the same way. One begins to perceive where possibility had been collapsed prematurely, where the field had been reduced, where exclusions had been normalized, where the invisible had become absolute merely because it was not being brought into consciousness. The limitation is still experienced as real in its consequences, but it is no longer confused with ultimate reality. This changes everything, because once the limitation is seen as limitation, reality becomes less fixed. Less fixed does not mean arbitrary. Less fixed does not mean unreal. Less fixed does not mean endlessly pliable to fantasy or wishful projection. It means that what had been taken as settled often reveals itself as conditional. What had been rendered final reveals itself as stabilized through repetition, symbol, and inherited agreement. What had appeared absolute begins to show itself as a frame. And once something is seen as frame, it no longer possesses the same imprisoning force. The world begins to breathe again. The field becomes more permeable. More of reality can move. More of life can enter. More of the hidden can approach without being immediately forced back into old enclosures. Reality becomes more available. This phrase must be felt in the full depth of what it means. Reality was never truly unavailable in its own essence. What changed is access. What changed is admissibility. What changed is the degree to which the human system can now receive more of what was always there without shutting it out through inherited compression. Availability increases because exclusion weakens. More relation can now be registered. More subtlety can now enter awareness. More contradiction can be held without panic. More process can be tolerated without premature conceptual closure. More mystery can remain alive without the old need to kill it through rigid naming. More of the world can now be lived as world rather than as the flattened rendering of a conditioned symbolic order. This is the return of seeing, not because seeing was completely absent before, but because seeing had been subordinated to unexamined mediation. The self was still seeing, but it was seeing through structures it did not know it was seeing through. Now those structures begin to reveal themselves. Seeing returns to itself by recognizing what had covered it. Seeing becomes more direct not by becoming structureless in an impossible sense, but by becoming more conscious of structure. The observer is no longer wholly fused with the lens. A distance opens. A clarity opens. A freedom opens. And with that opening, the world no longer appears only as what the old structure permitted. This return is also a return of honesty, because to see the lens is to stop pretending that one's world was ever raw, neutral, and untouched. It is to admit the role of conditioning, symbol, inherited distinction, fear, repetition, language, and social agreement in shaping what once felt self-evident. It is to acknowledge that much of what was called reality was already a rendering. This honesty is not humiliating in the destructive sense. It is liberating. It removes the false burden of defending the old frame as though it were existence itself. It allows the system to relax its grip on certainty. It permits a more intimate contact with what is actually present. It allows truth to be approached with greater humility and greater precision at once. The return of seeing is therefore not anti-world. It is not an escape from reality. It is not withdrawal into abstraction. It is not the rejection of distinction, structure, symbol, or embodied life. It is a more faithful participation in reality because the observer is no longer as unconsciously governed by the frame through which reality has been rendered. One can still work, build, relate, create, think, speak, design, act, and inhabit structures. But now one does so with more permeability to the real. The structures are no longer as absolute. The categories are no longer as total. The symbols are no longer as final. The person moves within the world while remaining less hypnotized by the world as previously partitioned. This matters not only spiritually or philosophically, but practically. A system that sees the lens becomes harder to manipulate through inherited symbolic freeze. It becomes less easily captured by false inevitabilities. It becomes less vulnerable to ambient distortions that depend on invisibility. It becomes more sensitive to where agreement is being unconsciously supplied. It becomes more capable of noticing when a limitation is not an actual truth but a stabilized contraction. It becomes more available to recognition. More available to widened perception. More available to truth as stable coherence within motion. More available to seeing how worlds are generated, maintained, and transformed. This is why nothing new is required. The foundational mechanics are already present. Awareness is already present. Perception is already operative. The lens is already shaping the field. Distinctions are already being drawn. Symbols are already being stabilized. Agreements are already being reinforced. The entire architecture is already underway. The problem was never that reality failed to provide enough. The problem was that the mediating structures were not seen clearly enough for what was already present to become more available. Thus the return is not toward novelty for novelty's sake. It is toward intimacy with what is already here. There is also profound tenderness in this, because the person who has spent years feeling trapped, confused, fragmented, or burdened by reality often imagines that release must come from some impossible future acquisition. They imagine they must become smarter, more disciplined, more special, more spiritual, more accomplished, more knowledgeable, more refined, more powerful, more anything than they are. Yet the return of seeing reveals something both humbling and relieving. The essential opening begins not with becoming superhuman, but with noticing what has been there all along. It begins with seeing the lens. It begins with recognizing the mediation. It begins with ceasing to confuse the rendering for the whole. Once this happens, even partially, the world can never fully return to the same closed state. The person may still have habits. The nervous system may still carry old contractions. Symbols may still exert force. Structures may still remain in place. Collective agreements may still press from every side. Distortions may still attempt to reassert themselves. But the absoluteness has been punctured. The observer has seen that the world as previously lived was not simply final. Something has shifted at the root. The lens has been seen. The magic of total identification with the old rendering weakens. Reality remains real, but it is less captive to the old partitions. The system can now begin to live in relation to the world rather than only inside its inherited closures. This is why the final movement of the book is not grand conquest, but simple return. Return to seeing, return to contact, return to the awareness that receives, return to the perception that can widen, return to the distinction between symbol and reality, return to the recognition that truth holds whether or not the old frame can yet fully carry it, return to the living field in which more is always available than the narrowed world once allowed. Nothing new is required, only seeing the lens. Once the lens is seen, distinction becomes visible, symbols loosen, limitations reveal themselves, and reality becomes less fixed, more available. This is the return, not the creation of another system to live inside, but the reopening of the capacity to see. Final transmission, the open field. There is no final conclusion. This is not because nothing can be known. It is not because truth dissolves into vagueness. It is not because reality is inaccessible, nor because all structure fails, nor because the search itself is meaningless. It is because what is being engaged here is not a closed argument that can be solved and set aside. It is not a symbolic puzzle that, once arranged correctly, becomes complete forever. It is not a doctrinal system to be mastered once and then repeated mechanically. It is not a belief structure meant to replace other belief structures. It is not a finished conceptual object. It is a living system, and because it is living, it cannot be exhausted by conclusion. A living system does not stop because the mind has achieved a satisfying formulation. A living system does not freeze because language has temporarily reached elegance. A living system continues unfolding because it is rooted in relation, motion, feedback, perception, awareness, change, stability within motion, truth within process, recognition within recurrence, widening within contact. The field remains alive because reality remains alive. The lens keeps changing because perception is not inert. Awareness keeps receiving because the world does not cease arriving. Distinctions keep forming. Symbols keep stabilizing and loosening. Agreements keep generating worlds. Recognition keeps breaking the filter. Expansion keeps widening the admissible. The loop remains alive. So there is no final conclusion, only deeper relation. This is one of the great reliefs and one of the great severities at once. The relief is that nothing essential depends upon forcing a final formula. The severity is that one cannot hide inside a final formula either. The system does not permit true life to be replaced by dead certainty forever. One can try. One can build doctrines. One can crystallize symbols. One can declare arrival. One can announce completion. One can treat one's latest frame as final truth. But if the field remains alive, reality will continue exceeding the frame. Perception will either widen further or contract again. Contradiction will either be integrated or begin accumulating. The loop will either remain open or begin closing back into rigidity. There is no permanent exemption from participation. You do not finish this, you continue seeing. This is the actual posture of the open field. Not endless restless seeking in the distorted sense, not compulsive spiritual hunger, not performative complexity, not addiction to novelty, not the refusal of any stable insight. Continuing to see means something much cleaner. It means the system remains available to direct contact. It means the lens is never again fully mistaken for the whole without question. It means distinction can still be used without being unconsciously worshipped. It means symbols can still function without becoming total prisons. It means truth can still be sought without being reduced to rigid ideology. It means recognition can still occur because the field remains permeable. It means the observer remains in relationship with reality rather than replacing reality with conclusion. Continuing to see is not incompletion as deficiency. It is openness as fidelity. It is the refusal to kill a living thing merely because the mind wishes to possess it. It is the willingness to let truth remain more foundational than narrative, more stable than ideology, more alive than doctrine, more coherent than inherited certainty, more subtle than symbolic conquest. It is the humility to recognize that because reality is living, participation in reality must also remain living. This is why what has been traced through this codex is not merely a theory of perception or a philosophy of awareness or a symbolic architecture of distinction, truth, distortion, and emergence. It is an invitation to a mode of relation. It is a reorientation in how one inhabits the very fact of being a perceiving node within a larger field. It is the return of intimacy with the mechanics through which worlds are rendered. It is the recognition that the world as lived is not final because the lens is not final. It is the recognition that perception can widen, awareness can receive more, symbols can loosen, distortions can collapse, truth can hold, and worlds can reorganize because the operative interface is alive. This is why the world reorganizes as perception widens. Not because the observer imposes some magical domination over reality. Not because fantasy overrides mechanics. Not because mere preference bends the cosmos to private will. The reorganization happens because the lived world of the system is inseparable from how the system parses, symbolizes, stabilizes, and participates. When the lens changes, the rendering changes. When the rendering changes, distinctions shift. When distinctions shift, symbols reconfigure. When symbols reconfigure, meanings reshape. When meanings reshape, actions change. When actions change, reinforcements change. When reinforcements change, patterns change. When patterns change across nodes, systems evolve. The world reorganizes not through arbitrary assertion, but through the lawful consequences of altered participation emerging from altered perception. Meaning reshapes. This must be understood deeply, because meaning is often mistaken for the primary layer when it is actually downstream. Meaning is what the system makes of what has been rendered available. It is not nothing. It is powerful. It organizes worlds. It governs emotion, structure, culture, identity, behavior, and possibility. But meaning is not immune to the widening of the field. As more becomes visible, old meanings fail. As more connections appear, previous interpretations thin out. As distortion loses force, meaning loses its artificial closures. The system does not merely acquire new meanings as decorative additions. It watches older meaning structures lose total authority because they no longer correspond to the range of reality now available within awareness. This can feel destabilizing at first, but it is also one of the clearest signs that the field is alive. A closed system protects meaning from contact. An open system lets meaning be reformed by contact. The difference between those two modes is the difference between ideology and living truthfulness, between symbolic imprisonment and symbolic participation, between a mind defending its frame and a perceiving system allowing reality to continue teaching it how to see. Systems evolve, not because evolution is guaranteed in some sentimental upward line. Not because every change is wise. Not because motion automatically equals maturation. Systems evolve because living relation cannot remain perfectly frozen. They either evolve toward greater coherence, or they evolve toward accumulated contradiction and eventual collapse. They either widen or harden. They either become more generative or more extractive. They either metabolize deeper truths or defend deeper distortions. They either remain open enough for recognition to keep occurring, or they solidify around older renderings until contradiction forces reorganization upon them. There is no true neutrality here. Living systems move. The question is not whether they move, but how. This is why the open field matters. The open field is not an ideology. It is not an identity. It is not a school. It is not a final stage. It is the condition in which seeing can continue. It is the refusal to allow symbolic closure to once again harden into totality. It is the willingness to remain with living reality as reality continues disclosing itself through widened perception. It is a field because it is not reducible to one proposition. It is open because it does not end in premature finality. It remains coherent because openness here is not chaos. It remains grounded because the openness is toward deeper contact with truth. not toward the endless inflation of subjective projection. In the open field, one does not discard structure. One learns the rightful place of structure. One does not discard symbol. One learns the rightful place of symbol. One does not discard meaning. One learns the rightful place of meaning. One does not discard distinction. One learns to see distinction as distinction. One does not discard the world. One learns to stop mistaking the current rendering of the world for the final totality of reality. This is the freedom at the heart of the transmission. Not freedom as arbitrary self-assertion. Not freedom as escapism. Not freedom as exemption from consequence. Freedom as less fusion with the lens. Freedom as increased permeability to the real. Freedom as participation in a world no longer frozen by invisible limitation. Freedom as the widening through which more of reality becomes available to awareness, and through which awareness, receiving more, reshapes the lens again. Because the lens has changed, the world changes. Because the world changes, the meanings that once organized the world must also change. Because meanings change, systems begin either to reorganize in greater coherence or resist and reveal their distortion more openly. Because systems reorganize, the collective field shifts. Because the collective field shifts, future nodes inherit a different world. This is how the open field moves through history without needing to announce itself as doctrine. It widens node by node. It reveals distortion where distortion had hardened into common sense. It loosens symbols where symbols had become prisons. It returns reality to availability where reality had been mistaken for finalized rendering. It allows truth to deepen rather than be merely defended. It restores motion where closure had pretended to be certainty. This is why the work is never truly done in the dead sense. Not because progress must be endless strain. Not because the system is never allowed rest. Not because one is condemned to permanent searching. But because life itself remains relational, and the deepest sanity is to stay available to relation. Rest may occur, stability may occur, great clarity may occur, profound coherence may occur, even deep settlement may occur, but none of these require the death of seeing. In fact, their deepest integrity depends on seeing remaining alive. So there is no final conclusion. There is only the deepening of contact. There is only the continued recognition of the lens. There is only the widening that allows more of the real to enter. There is only the loosening of what once appeared absolute. There is only the ongoing clarification of what is true, what is distortion, what is symbol, what is structure, what is inherited, what is direct, what is stable, what is merely defended, what holds, what contradicts itself, what generates, what consumes, what opens, what closes. And beneath all of this, there is the simple and inexhaustible movement. Continue seeing, not because you forced reality to become more, because you are no longer seeing through the same lens. And that changes everything without ever needing to announce itself as final.